Chapter 1910. Although the Yenlu kingdom ruled by the 11th prince was a kingdom, it was actually a world of its own. However, since it was under the rule of the heavenly court, it was connected to the universe and the closest one to it was Shinsun Zhou. A few days ago, 7th Prince Haocheng's trusted aide, Mang Gao. He came here personally. Previously, someone secretly revealed that although the 11th prince did not have any deities under his command, the entire Yenlu kingdom was under his complete control and his gains were not any less than theirs. Moreover, the 11th prince did not have any demon soldiers under his command, which made him a perfect target for them to attack. Therefore, when they asked for offerings, Haocheng did not reply. Since Haocheng was unwilling to give in, they were prepared to use force to force him. However, there was a hindrance here. The Yenlu kingdom was located in a remote area. It was separated by the Boundary River and separated by the Tianyuan Mountains. Unless one had a talisman from the Heavenly Emperor, one would not be able to pass through. Naturally, the 7th prince did not have such a thing. In addition, he had to leave some demon soldiers behind to guard against the other princes. Therefore, he could not launch a large-scale attack and could only send his trusted aide to recruit demons. In the Shinsun Island, there were many demons that had been chased out of the Yenlu kingdom that day, as well as wild demons that had been wandering around the area. These demon soldiers were gathered by Mang Gao, and with the help of the many attendants he brought with him, he managed to gather 100,000 people in just a few days. When Haocheng heard about the commotion here, he immediately summoned Jiaying for a discussion. Jiaying said, "Your Highness, although the Yenlu kingdom does not need demon soldiers, all the people in the kingdom can fight for us. Your Highness can recruit as many as you want." Haocheng shook his head and said, "The Yenlu kingdom is a small country with few people. Even if we can repel the enemy, it will definitely hurt our foundation. Even if we can force them to retreat this time, what if they come again?" Jiaying thought for a while and said, "Your Highness wants to force them to retreat without using weapons?" Haocheng nodded and said, "Official Jia, can you do that?" Jiaying lowered his head and thought for a while before saying, "Your Highness, please allow me to think about it." After he left, he thought that if he wanted to repel 100,000 demon soldiers led by a celestial general without using weapons, he would have to borrow the power of the mountain. Thus, he ordered someone to find Lin Huaizhan for a discussion. When Lin Huaizhan heard this, he was puzzled. "Martial uncle, why don't you let martial nephew handle this matter? I've seen many of those demons on my way here, but I don't think they have much ability. We can kill them outside the border river." Jiaying asked, "Can you kill 100,000 demon soldiers in one night?" Lin Huaizhan said, "That's a little difficult. If it's 10 days or half a month, I can give it a try." Jiaying sighed, 10 days to half a month and we would have already entered the Yenlu kingdom. Moreover, if the 7th prince were to see you, he would definitely ask for help from the Qi practitioners or the celestial officials. You might not even have the chance then. "King," Prince said, "King Huaizhan, and Princes Ming, Lin." "Kingdom, King, King Princes King, I, Prince, I, King A, Kingdom, I, King," Jiaying said, "You mean to get rid of the people sent by Prince 7? He shook his head and said, "That's not appropriate. Although the person who came is only a trusted follower of the 7th prince, he must be protected by a divine general. Moreover, he is a divine being himself. If we kill him wantonly, the celestial court will definitely punish us. Even if it's hard to punish us, the Liwang mountain will still blame you." Lin Huaizhan laughed and said, "But we don't have to get rid of them." Jiaying heard him and thought for a while before saying, "Then let's give it a try." That night, Lin Huaizhan left Yenlu country. Without identifying the direction, he rushed towards the towering demonic qi and directly came to the enemy's camp. After taking a careful look above the camp, he found that there were indeed immortal generals guarding the camp. However, the defense was unusually lax. Lin Huaizhan was a little confused. In reality, although the princes were competing with each other, it was only the demon soldiers killing each other. No one dared to do anything to the immortal officials or divine generals. Otherwise, the heavenly court would definitely punish them. Currently, no one dared to cross this boundary, so there was no need to be on guard against them. Moreover, Mang Gao was only here on 7th Prince's order to preside over the attack. He was not the prince himself. Even if he was dead, another person could be sent to replace him. Mang Gao himself was not that important, so it was impossible to have too many guards. When Lin Huaizhan saw this, he suddenly felt a little more confident. He avoided the main camp and came to the foot of a small hill. He took out an incense burner and lit it. The smoke drifted in the air and condensed into the shape of a little monkey. It looked very intelligent. He whispered a few instructions, and the little monkey seemed to have understood. It squeaked a few times at him, and with a flash, it scuttled into the camp. About 4 hours later, the little monkey came back. It left empty-handed but came back with a pouch. From the shape, it was obvious that it was used by the Heaven Court. Lin Huaizhan was overjoyed. He patted the little monkey's head and kept it in the incense burner. He did not alert the demon soldiers. Instead, he quietly returned to Yanlu Kingdom and reported the matter to Jiaying. Jiaying was surprised. I didn't expect martial nephew to succeed. If the enemy retreats, you will be the main contributor. Lin Huaizhan said, this item has an owner but I can't open it. I don't know if it is that item. Jiaying nodded. Don't worry. We will know in 2 days. However, they did not expect that on the second day, Shen Sun Zhou's reply was already a mess. The reason why the disciples were able to recruit the demons was not because of their status as princes, but because they promised enough blood food and goods as a reward. These goods were carried by Mang Gao, which was what Gao Lin and Huaizhan took away that night. According to the rules, these items should be placed separately. This way, even if they were stolen, they would not disappear completely. The missing parts could be retrieved from the rear. However, Mang Gao wanted to save trouble and put them all in one place. This caused the demons to be unwilling to follow his orders. After discovering this, he knew that he would definitely be punished and executed by the 7th prince if he returned, so he simply abandoned the camp and left. When the immortal generals saw this, they felt that there was no need to stay any longer, so they all retreated. The 100,000 demon soldiers had no one to restrain them and they had no blood to feed on, so they dispersed in a hubbub, and the disaster disappeared without a trace. Zhang Yan watched the changes in the world from within the realm of forgetfulness. Just as Lin Huaizhan was resolving the crisis, he saw the emperor's qi on the 11th prince's body suddenly increase. The main reason was that the 11th prince did not reveal his true strength. Hence, the other princes only thought that he was lucky and did not think that he had much strength. He looked in the direction of the heavenly court. As he placed his piece, the disciples of his sect gradually entered into the karma of this place. The scene in front of him became clearer and clearer. Now, he could faintly see a light in the world. Although he could not distinguish it clearly, he was able to see some things. Just as he had guessed, the heavenly court had an item, but they could not control it. This was the item that many spirit refinement cultivators wanted, or a part of it. No matter which Dao vein was recognized by the heavenly court, they would also have the right to possess this item. Once the true body paid attention to it, they could take it away. This was the origin of the battle between the Tao of integrity and the Tao of virtue. However, these powerful cultivators were only a strand of consciousness. They did not know when the true body would pay attention to it. Hence, before that, they could only try their best to ensure that the item fell into their hands. He could sense that this item was also very important to him. Although it was difficult to know what it was very likely that it would be an indispensable part of his Tao path in the future. As such, he had to fight for it. However, it was a pity that even though his power could suppress these consciousnesses, if he directly chased them away, he would alert the true body behind him. Hence, he could only slowly plan for it. Thankfully, after knowing all this, he had sorted out his thoughts. In the future, he would no longer need to fumble around and take things one step at a time. Instead, he could act freely. The first thing he needed to do was to do what the other powerful cultivators had planned and try to push a prince onto the throne. But from the looks of it, apart from the 11th prince, there was no other suitable candidate. His gaze landed on the state of Yen Lu. Among the princes, someone had actually chosen the 11th prince, who appeared to be the weakest and was the furthest away. There was definitely someone behind this. He secretly thought that this was very likely Quan Dao's doing. They probably thought that the 11th prince could stand on the stage now and that he could share some of the pressure for Quan Dao. Quan Dao probably felt that if he told him directly, there might not be any results, so he used this method. He thought about it. This time, the problem had been resolved. However, if they were not willing to give up, he might use other methods. Although the fact that he supported the 11th prince would be exposed sooner or later, he had to pay attention to the timing. At the very least, he had to choose the right time and not be forced to appear. Hence, he had to find some trouble for this person and let him know that he had his own way of doing things and that he did not need anyone to interfere. In the Apricot continent, the second prince, Hao Ji, had previously offended the Forgottenly Mountain and lost all his demon soldiers. Moreover, he had occupied the best piece of land among the many fiefs. Hence, the other princes naturally would not miss this opportunity. While he was weak, they continuously sent demon soldiers to attack him. Among them was the third prince, whom Quan Dao thought highly of. In order to deal with the invasion of the princes, Hao Ji also had to attend to one thing and lose sight of another. Fortunately, he had the help of a perfected immortal sent by De Dao. Not long after, they set up a barrier of the heavenly river at the border, which resolved the crisis. Just as he was trying to recover his strength, a crack appeared on the barrier for some reason. The direction of the heavenly river coincidentally led to the third prince's fief. The third prince did not hesitate to lead his army in. However, Hao Ji was much more relaxed when dealing with the enemies along the way. After a few battles, no one gained the upper hand. Instead, both sides suffered heavy losses. At this time, the other princes saw that the third prince seemed to have an opportunity and attacked him simultaneously. Seeing this, Hao Ji gloated over the third prince's misfortune and did not let him go. This caused the third prince to become the target of everyone. For a moment, he was badly battered and had no choice but to seek help from Quan Dao. It was not difficult for Quan Dao's two grand elders to understand the reason for this. In order to resolve this matter, after a discussion, one of them once again came to the Forgottenly Mountain. Chapter 1911. When Zhang Yan sensed that Quan Dao had returned, he opened the door and welcomed him in. After greeting him, he invited him to take a seat and said, "What brings you here today?" The Taoist replied, "I'm here to discuss the succession of the heavenly arch." The third prince was currently in a precarious situation and Quan Dao understood the reason behind it. Hence, he had returned to resolve this matter. Furthermore, in order to prevent an even bigger conflict in the future, he had decided not to reveal too much of his plan to the third prince. Zhang Yan also understood the meaning behind his words and asked directly, "Who do you have in mind?" The Taoist bowed and said, "The third prince can be the heavenly arch." Zhang Yan smiled faintly. Originally, the third prince was indeed the person he wanted to choose, but the 11th prince was another choice. In fact, they were on par with each other. However, now that the 11th prince was entrusted to him, the 11th prince was naturally second. Today, the Taoist came to confirm with him that the third prince would be the leader and the 11th prince could give up at any time. He would not agree to this. Furthermore, he did not believe that Quan Dao really had no other choices. Since the Taoist did not speak to him, it meant that the Taoist still had reservations about him. Hence, he pondered for a while and said, "The mysteries of the heavens are chaotic, and the emperor's aura is not clear. Everyone should rely on their own luck." What he meant was to maintain the status quo. There was no need to decide who would be the leader and who would be the second. The person who could walk to the end would naturally be the most suitable one. His suggestion was actually correct, and Quan Dao obviously knew that as well. However, what he wanted was the right to be the leader. He hoped that Zhang Yan would cooperate with him and not start from scratch. His answer was obviously not satisfactory to the Taoist. The Taoist said, Previously, I heard that the Taoist of virtue had sent a disciple to your mountain. If you have any trouble, you can tell me. Zhang Yan smiled and said, it's no big deal. It's just some threats. I will not care if they want me to be under their wings. The Taoist was silent for a while before saying, since Taoist has an objection to the selection of the emperor, we can discuss it after the heavenly mystery is clear. Zhang Yan smiled and nodded. The other party had clearly taken a step back. The meaning behind this was that since they had different opinions, there was no need to insist on a result. They could put the matter aside for now and wait for the situation to change before making a decision. This was exactly what he had expected. Quan Dao would not shed all pretense of cordiality with him for now, because he did not want to lose him as an ally. Even if they could not be on good terms, they could not be on bad terms, especially under the premise that De Dao also seemed to have the intention to recruit him. It would be unwise to push him to the side of morality and Dao. Of course, he had his own considerations. He would definitely not enter the path of virtue. This was something that these two obviously did not know. At this time he said, virtue and Taoism are our generation's great enemy. I think that we can reconcile on the big and discuss on the small. The Taoist thought for a while and nodded in agreement. Then, he said, the second Prince Hao Ji is someone that the German country favors. We should not act rashly. We should first cut off the weak branches and leaves before deciding on the main branch. Zhang Yan said, this is exactly what I want. Although it was a battle between the princes, those who had the support of the Grand Supreme would not be easily defeated. For example, this time, the 11th prince did not even need to move a single soldier to resolve the attack easily. If it was someone else, they would not be able to deal with it so easily. Since that was the case, they could only go around these tough opponents first and defeat the rest before comparing who was stronger. If they attacked someone like the second prince right from the start, De Dao would definitely protect him with all his might. Once they started, it would be difficult to stop. Following closely behind, the disciples of the two lineages would definitely enter the fray. In the end, it might even cause the Grand Supreme to personally enter the fray. This kind of thing had to be avoided as much as possible. Even if they really had to fight, it couldn't happen too early. The Taoist got Zhang Yan's approval and said, the matter of the throne concerns my future worshippers. We have to be careful. My disciple Zhong Quanzi is in charge of the daily affairs of the sect. When the time comes, he will come and discuss this matter with you. The Grand Supreme usually only decided on the general situation. When it came to detailed matters, they would be handled by the sect. Zhang Yan nodded and said, I will also instruct my disciples to cooperate with your sect. The Taoist saw that he had more or less achieved his goal. After a few more polite words, he left. Zhang Yan thought for a while and then called out in his mind. Not long after, Dantian, Xiuguang, Yiguang, Chenguang, and Dingguang, 6 sword-bearing disciples came to the hall. Once they entered, they bowed to him and called him Patriarch. Zhang Yan said, the celestial emperor's position is about to change. All the princes are fighting for it. If the Forgottenly Mountain wants to be the orthodox sect, we must choose one to support. The 11 princes have the emperor's aura and are open-minded. They are not bound by the rules. They can be used by us. Xiuguang, Chenguang, Yiguang, the 3 of you go down the mountain and protect him. The 3 bowed and accepted the order. He then gave a few instructions to Dantian, Yiguang, and Dingguang. Then, he gave them some magical weapons and let them go down the mountain to do what they wanted. After Dantian went down the mountain, he said goodbye to his fellow disciples and went to the Dazhou kingdom alone. Not long after, he found a tall rampart halfway up the West Shang Path's Baiju mountain. He landed on the open space in front of the rampart and walked in without looking at the guards. Left Imperial Minister In Kuang was sitting behind a table and seemed to be reading something. He noticed someone came in and looked up. When he saw it was Dantian, there was no surprise on his face. He nodded and said, Taoist, please take a seat. There is tea beside the table. Please forgive me for being slow. Dantian didn't stand on ceremony and sat down at the side. He said, "Left imperial minister is famous across the heavens, but he still stays in the same place. Are you really not afraid of the celestial court's attack?" Ing Kuang quickly wrote something. After a while, he put down the brush and looked up. He sat up straight and said with a sharp gaze, "The more the better. I'm just afraid that this person won't come." Over the years, he relied on the heavenly talisman to defeat the celestial court many times. His reputation grew and he even protected many immortal officials who violated the law of heaven. Furthermore, he had done something else. After these immortal officials were stripped of their immortal records, they lost their divine abilities and techniques. They were no different from ordinary people. When they died, they were destined to fall into the underworld. This was unbearable to them unless they turned to cultivating Tao techniques. However, it was very difficult because cultivation couldn't be achieved in a day. If one didn't start cultivating at a young age, it would be difficult to achieve much. However, he had the heavenly talisman in his hand. He could let them cultivate the divine techniques derived from the celestial book. After they died, he could use the heavenly talisman to protect them and prevent them from falling into the underworld. This was something these immortal officials couldn't refuse. Not only that, he also won over many mortal imperial emperors. These country emperors didn't have the guts to overthrow the celestial court. However, on one hand, they wanted to live forever. On the other hand, they were quite dissatisfied with the immortals who demanded too much. They would be happy to see someone find trouble with this person. On the surface, he didn't establish any big force. However, he secretly controlled a lot of power. At this moment, he stared at Dandy Guang and said, "Daoist, are you here to remind me or is there something else?" Dandy Guang chuckled and said, "Whatever Zui Yuzhong wants to do, go ahead and do it. I just want to remind you that if you want to change the immortals, you can't be too hasty. Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to do anything." Ing Kuang's heart shook. He took a deep breath and knew that the time he waited for was finally here. With the heavenly talisman, he didn't need to fear the celestial lords in terms of strength. However, without the support of a supreme, he was just a slightly bigger ant. Tao of virtue helped him get the heavenly talisman. However, Celestial Emperor didn't care and didn't take back the heavenly talisman. It seemed that Ing Kuang still had some use for him. Thus, he could only rely on the other Grand Elder to continue fulfilling his ambitions. Liwang Mountain was willing to support him, so this worry was gone. He said seriously, "Daoist, don't worry. There are billions of immortals in the world. How can I kill them all? Even if I can, it will be my disciples' problem." Dandy Guang said, "It's good that Zui Yuzhong knows. What do you plan to do after descending?" Ing Kuang said, "The princes are fighting for the throne. The heavens are not at peace and the realms are not at peace. The people of the lower realms are not the only ones affected. Qi cultivators are also affected. I want to find all the cultivators in the world to work together." After all, he was the Zui Yuzhong. He knew that he couldn't get rid of the immortals by himself. He had to rely on other forces. After the princes went to their fiefdoms, they fought with each other and killed Qi cultivators. On one hand, the celestial heavens didn't have good intentions towards these people who didn't follow orders. On the other hand, Celestial Emperor wanted to kill some major forces before the throne was passed down. These people were his potential allies. He started doing this a long time ago. After descending, not only did he save the mortals, he made a name for himself. He also visited famous itinerant immortals and promised that if he could overthrow the celestial heavens, he would kill the immortals and spread the Tao. Of course, he knew that these people wouldn't just listen to him, but at least some of them could be won over to his side. Dandy Guang looked at him and smiled, "Since Zui Yuzhong already has a plan, I will wait and see." After Grand Elder Quan Dao visited Mount Liwang, the third prince's troubles quickly subsided. However, he also lost a lot of vitality and needed to recover. The other princes also lost a lot in this battle. Seeing that they didn't have any more chances, they all retreated and silently gathered their strength. Similarly, the 11th prince also used this rare period of peace to organize the affairs of the kingdom and tried his best to strengthen the kingdom. In the Qing-Tai continent, the 7th prince had forcefully seized a lot of offerings and used them to recruit more demon soldiers. He had also used the help of the Heavenly Mother to transfer some of the Heaven Court's officials and heavenly generals who had violated the heavenly law to his side. His strength had increased tremendously. However, he had learned his lesson after suffering a loss. Seeing that no one was moving, he did not move. This silence lasted for 10 years. However, this period of peace was short. When he felt that he had recovered, the 9th prince was the first one who couldn't take it anymore. He led 1,000,000 demon soldiers across the Boundary River and charged towards the 8th prince. At the same time, many of the Supreme Sect's subordinates also descended. Everyone knew that after this battle, even if they couldn't fight for the throne, the outcome would be clear. Chapter 1912. The princes had been fighting and killing each other for 2 years, and 3 of them had lost their territories and had no choice but to withdraw from the fight for the throne. However, before the victors could digest the territories they had conquered, they were surrounded by the other princes. Those who were at a disadvantage could only form alliances and help each other. Although they were at a disadvantage, they would not collapse in the short term. The Manchu continent was the 4th prince, Hao Diao's conferred land. In the previous battles, he had initially obtained a lot of benefits. Unfortunately, he suffered a series of defeats in the subsequent battles and had to give up almost all of his gains. Now, he could only retreat and try his best to protect himself. Beside a large rock by the river, 2 burly men sat facing each other. Each of them had a large wine jar placed beside them. They were the 2 monster kings under the 4th prince. To the south was the Mastiff King Kenji, while to the north was the Flood Dragon King Hu Chao. Jiao King Kanji looked at the wine jar beside him, but he didn't touch it. His expression and posture showed that he was quite alert. He glared and said, "Jiao King, what important matter did you summon me here today?" The Flood Dragon King Hu Chao lowered his voice and said, "The 4th prince will not be able to hold on for much longer. Has the Mastiff King thought about what we should do after this one is defeated?" Kenji was stunned for a moment before he laughed and said, "I was wondering what it was. So this is the reason. That's easy. If this place doesn't work, we can just move to another place. There will still be enough blood to eat. Didn't we go through the same thing before? There's no need for the Flood Dragon King to worry about this." The demon soldiers recruited by the disciples were actually a motley crew. Without the suppression of a monster king, they would not be able to be used as they wished. However, most of the monster kings did not have much foresight and only cared about what was in front of them. As long as there were benefits, they would swarm forward, but if there were difficulties, they would disperse. They did not have much loyalty to the prince they served. If they were defeated, they would just change to another prince. The Flood Dragon King Hu Chao said leisurely, "Oh. Is that really what the Mastiff King thinks? Now that you have more and more subordinates, you don't have to do this if it's just for blood." The tiny eyes of the Jiao King Kanji revealed a glimmer of light. He put away his casual expression just now and revealed a bit of seriousness. He stared at him and said, "Aren't you the same, Jiao King?" Flood Dragon King Hu Chao's expression turned serious as he said, "This is the reason why I asked Mastiff King to come here." He pointed at Hu Chao and then at himself. "You and I both have great ambitions. We are far from those fools." Although most of the fiendish demons were short-sighted, not all of them were like that. Some of the leaders were also quite intelligent and used this opportunity to secretly strengthen their subordinates. For example, the 2 of them were like this. Originally, they only had a few hundred soldiers under their command, and demon kings could easily find a bunch of them. However, after all these years of battle, they had tens of thousands of soldiers under their command. Most importantly, these were all elite soldiers, not people who were just there to make up the numbers. Originally, the celestial monarch sent the princes down to the lower bound to weaken the fiendish demons, chi practitioners, and even the powerful celestials. But in reality, the ones who suffered losses were mostly the common people and some of the inferior wild monsters. Ambitious demon kings like them mostly used this opportunity to obtain benefits that they could not even imagine. The Jiao King Kanji stretched his huge body and said, "Jiao King, if you have anything to say, you can say it directly. If it is not to my liking, then I will pretend that I have never heard of it and never come here." The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "Fine, I only have one question. Do you plan to continue like this?" The Jiao King Kanji glanced at him and said, "What else can I do?" The Flood Dragon King, Hu Chao, said in a low voice, "The world is in chaos now, but has King Qing ever thought that once the princes have decided on the throne, we will be of no use? Maybe there is another use." He nodded his head. "Maybe the Heaven Court will push the blame of the chaos on us and use our heads to appease the anger of the worlds." The Jiao King Kanji snorted and said, "Jiao King, aren't you thinking too much?" He pouted his lips and reminded, "The celestial lords are watching us from above, we need to be careful." Flood Dragon King Hu Chao leaned back slightly and nodded. "Fine, just take it as I'm spouting nonsense. But that's not the case. Without war, how can we afford to raise so many troops? Have you ever thought about it?" The Jiao King Kanji said, "Then what do you think, old Jiao?" The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "No matter what, we are just scattered soldiers. If there is no one to rely on, then to put it bluntly, we are just roving bandits." As he said this, his tone became heavier and he said word by word, "Only when we have the country can we be respected." The Jiao King Kanji's expression changed several times. After a long time, he said, "Just now, you think I have never thought about it, but the Heaven Court does not allow it." The Jiao King Hu Chao's eyes lit up and he said, "Have you forgotten that there are more than 800 countries and 3,000 foreign continents under the rule of the Heaven Court?" The Jiao King obviously knew what was going on. He shook his head and said, "That is different. Living with the barbarian tribes, the monarch is also a human, and there is no legal order. If not, why would the Heaven Court treat it as an exception?" The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "It was impossible before, but it is not impossible now." He moved closer and said, "When the princes compete, the winner will inherit the throne. As long as we choose one person and rely on him, then we will ask for a title. Do you think we will go back on our words in the future?" The Jiao King Kanji was a little tempted. According to this plan, there was a possibility of success. But he was still clear-headed and did not get carried away by the picture. He said, "But we still need to know who is the next venerable emperor. Otherwise, no matter how much we promise, it will just be an empty piece of paper." The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "I have already considered this. Now, there are only 4 people who are most likely to inherit the throne. One is the second prince. His Highness is the son of the celestial monarch and mother Liao. He is also supported by virtue and Tao, so he is the most likely to sit in the celestial court." The Jiao King Kanji interrupted, "If that is the case, isn't the first prince even more justifiable?" The Jiao King Hu Chao smiled and said, "The first prince is indeed the most suitable candidate. But if he could inherit the throne, there would be no such thing as today." The Jiao King Kanji nodded and said, "Then how many people are there?" The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "The second is the third prince. He is also not simple and should be supported by the whole Tao. As for the third, it is the 11th prince. He seems to have an expert guiding him. For example, when the 7th prince attacked the Yanlu kingdom, it was resolved without a sound. This is not simple. And the last one is the 14th prince who has not been released by the celestial palace. Although he is young, with the venerable emperor by his side, his chances are not small." 4 people. The Jiao King Kanji thought about it and felt a headache. He said, "We can't go and rely on all 4 of them, right?" The Jiao King Hu Chao said, "The 14th prince is in the celestial court. It is difficult for us to rely on him, so we can forget about him. But the other 3 are in their fiefdoms. Among them, the 11th prince is weak and it is hard to know his background. Moreover, he does not take in demon soldiers, so there is no need to look for him. The second prince and the third prince have the support of the Grand Elder, so they are the most likely to gain power. We can go and seek refuge in one place. We can try to get the Imperial Edict and the Founding Edict. This way, no matter who wins the kingdom, the other party can go and seek refuge there. Then, we can sleep peacefully. The Jiao King Kanji thought about it and said, but what if we all choose wrongly? The Jiao King Hu Chao said in a deep voice, that is better than not doing anything in front of us. We will not lose anything anyway. Moreover, he looked up and said, what if we bet correctly? The Jiao King Kanji nodded and grabbed the wine jar. He removed the mud seal and poured the wine down his throat. When he was done, he smashed the jar on the rock and shouted, then it is decided. At this moment, in the Yenlu kingdom, compared to the fiefs of the princes, this was one of the rare peaceful lands. Haoning's subordinates had asked him to send troops to attack when the prince's fiefs were empty, but he rejected them with the reason that the time was not right. One of the reasons was that Qingguang and the others who came from Mount Liwang advised him to wait a little longer. Another reason was that the soldiers of the kingdom could not fight against the demon soldiers yet. This was because other than brute strength, the demons more or less knew some spells. Moreover, when the numbers reached a certain level, there would definitely be a big demon to hold the line. The army formed by mortals would often be shaken by a demon wind. Although the Yenlu kingdom had the Dragon King of Overflowing Water's subordinates, most of them were from the water tribe, so they could not fight on land. Jiang suggested a few times that they could send letters to all the Qi practitioners to help them. If they succeeded the throne in the future, they could grant them the right to establish their own sections. However, Haoning did not give a clear answer. He understood that the Qi practitioners were not easy to get along with. They only followed the rules of the mountain and never cared about the rules of the heaven court. If they were to be indulged today, it could lead to even worse consequences tomorrow. Perhaps, even the foundation of the heaven court would be shaken. Furthermore, he was afraid that if he were to open his mouth and the heavenly monarch knew about it, he would not be able to succeed the throne. Jiang also guessed some of the reasons. He thought that the only way to solve this problem was to seek help from the mountain. Thus, after careful consideration, he came to Yi Guang and the others for advice. After listening, Yi Guang smiled and said, the 11th prince's thoughts are not unreasonable. This problem is not difficult to solve. As long as we set the rules first, those who are willing to work with us can come, and those who are unwilling to leave, we will be able to invite those who are suitable to work with us. If they do not follow the rules, the heavenly monarch will punish them in the future. Furthermore, the heavenly monarch has rewarded many Qi practitioners with high cultivation in the past. As for why the heavenly monarch is doing this, I think the 11th prince understands. If you are worried about this, then there is no need for you to do so. Jiang quickly conveyed the words to the 11th prince. The latter thought about it and felt that it was reasonable. He immediately cast aside all his worries and sent letters to the heavens, inviting Qi practitioners to join them. When the other princes saw this, they also wanted to follow suit. However, most of the offerings were spent on the demon soldiers. Moreover, most of the human cultivators were not willing to work with the demons. Thus, the effect of their efforts was minimal. In the second year, Haoning saw that his forces were gradually forming, so he led his people out of the border river and occupied the Shinsun continent. Then, the cultivators used their supernatural powers and rode on the wind and clouds. In a night, they passed through 3 continents and 5 prefectures and entered the territory of the 7th prince. They fought a fierce battle and successfully drove him out. Thus, another prince was eliminated from the battle for the throne. Zhang Yan observed from the mountain and saw that after the battle, the emperor's aura around the 11th prince was almost similar to that of the 2nd prince and the 3rd prince. It could be said that the momentum was starting to grow. He calculated that in the next few years, the princes who did not have the support of the Grand Elder would be gradually driven out of the game. This battle would soon come to an end. Chapter 1913. In the ZK mountain, the Dao's disciples Zhi Lu, Zhi Chang, and Zhi Xing were talking about how the 11th prince had chased away the 7th prince. The 11th prince was the first to be demoted to the lower realm. In the past, he did not recruit demon soldiers, nor did he worship any gods. He was very inconspicuous. However, the moment he rose up, he displayed such great strength. This attracted the attention of Dao, because the 11th prince was now a threat to the second prince. There was now one more opponent that he had to face. Zhichang said, I heard that a lot of Qi practitioners have gone to the 11th prince's side. On the surface, it looks like this prince is relying on the support of the 11th prince. But there was news that there were Liwang mountain cultivators in the Yanlu kingdom. It seems like the 11th prince has the support of the Liwang mountain, or else he wouldn't have risen so fast. Zhi Sheng's expression became vigilant as he said, that's not to be underestimated. With the support of the Grand Elder, it was not something that could be suppressed by ordinary means. Zhi Lu waved his hand and said, there is no need to be so anxious. Right now, Quan Dao is what I need to deal with. There is only one Taishang standing behind Liwang mountain. At most, he can hold on and not be defeated, but he can't change the overall situation. Zhichang said, but what if leaving Wang Mountain is a perfect path? Zhi Lu didn't say anything at first, then slowly said, that's a great enemy. Zhi Xing said, Shixiang, since it's hard to confirm, why don't we send some people to get rid of all the cultivators at the foot of Mount Forgetfulness? Zhi Lu shook his head and said, that's not appropriate. If the Forgottenly Mountain really colludes with the entire path, if I make a move, it will only lead to a battle for the Dao vein. Now that the throne has not been decided, it's not appropriate to do so. If these two have not come into contact with each other, this will instead force them to join forces. Zhixing thought for a moment and said, both ways are not possible. Then what does senior brother mean? Zhi Lu stroked his beard and pondered for a moment before saying, I shall pay a visit to the founding master and ask for a letter of advice to grant him some benefits. If he still refuses, then there is no need to say anything more. We shall find a way to get rid of him. Zhixing said, if Forgottenly Mountain agreed just like that, wouldn't it be too easy for them? Zhi Yu replied, we are only making suggestions. The gains and losses here will be decided by the founding master. When Zhi Sheng and Zhi Chang heard this, they cupped their fists and acknowledged. Zhi Lu immediately went to the upper palace to report to the three Taishang of virtue and Dao. Not long after, a Daoist came out of the purple tower and headed towards Mount Liwang. When he reached the door, he did not enter the mountain but waited at the door for a reply. Zhang Yan waited for his disciple to hand over the letter. He opened it and read it. He could not help but laugh. It was still the same old story, but the promise this time was a little more than the previous time. It said that no matter what he did before, as long as he was willing to turn around and attack the whole path, in terms of merit after that, if he contributed a lot, he might be allowed to enter the whole path and enjoy the heavenly court together. With a wave of his sleeve, the letter dispersed like light. What was said here was just empty words. What was considered a great merit and what was considered a small merit, it was still up to the people of virtue and Dao to decide. If he really listened to these words and fell out with the whole path, when the whole path was defeated, the two Taishang might be fine, but he would definitely be pushed out of this world. He changed his mind and immediately wrote a letter. The words in it were nothing more than people of different paths cannot work together. He then ordered someone to send it down the mountain. After the messenger received the letter, he bowed towards the peak of the mountain and returned to the Purple Tower mountain. Zhang Yan already knew that the 11th prince had shocked the world with a single feat, and there was even the appearance of Mount Liwang in his country. This would definitely attract the attention of the Dao of virtue and Dao. However, this prince would eventually walk to the front stage. It would be good to not make a move at this moment and wait for others to decide the winner. However, the winner did not only depend on one's capability, but also one's heart and spirit. As long as the winner did not fall and continued to receive support, he would become stronger and stronger. When the general trend was formed, it would be like the sky had turned upside down. It would be unstoppable. Therefore, he had to stand out and fight for it. After the Dao of virtue and Dao received his reply, they would definitely make a move on Yanlu country. Only by enduring this would there be a future to speak of. However, long before the 11th prince made his move, he had already made another arrangement and also prepared a way to deal with it. In the Purple Tower Mountain, Zhilu returned to the palace and waited there patiently. After a long time, a clear voice was heard. Zhiyu opened his eyes and said, "It's the imperial order from the ancestral master." The three of them stood up and bowed towards the east. After a while, a boy came with a green jade rui in his hand and said loudly, "The imperial order from the ancestral master, Mount Li Wang will not listen to my words. As for how to act, it is up to you." Zhilu bowed and said, "As you wish." At this moment, another clear voice was heard. The boy kept the rui, and with a magic cloud under his feet, he had already turned around and left. Zhilu straightened up, shook his head and sighed, "Since Mount Li Wang is not willing to turn back, then it is a stumbling block for my Tao of virtue and Tao. I can only move it away." He said to Ji Chang and Ji Sheng, "Mount Li Wang's Grand Supreme will be dealt with by the three ancestral masters. We only need to take down his disciples. How many true immortals of Mount Li Wang are with the 11th prince, have you two found out?" Ji Sheng said, "Just now, I have already asked. On the surface, the 11th prince has 3 true immortals protecting him. Their Taoist names are Qingguang, Yiguang, and Xiuguang. 3 people." Zhi Lu stroked his beard and thought. If it was Quan Dao, he could roughly estimate their cultivation from their Taoist names. However, he was not familiar with Mount Li Wang, so it was difficult for him to understand the importance of these 3 people. He calculated with his spell and instantly found a trace of connection. He immediately knew that Qingguang was the one who wiped out the demons under the second prince. But knowing this was not very useful, because in their eyes, the demons were really too weak. As long as a cultivator had a little bit of cultivation, they could easily do what they did that day, so it was hard to make a judgment with just this. He said, "If that is the case, this person might be below me, or he might be on par with me." Ji Chang said, "Let's be lenient and deal with him carefully." He suggested, "Junior apprentice brother Ji Gong is good at looking at qi and distinguishing techniques. We can ask him to go for a walk, and we will know the background of this person." Ji Lu thought for a while and said, "That is the only way." In Mount Zik, other than Ji Lu and the other 2, there were many people of the same generation. It was just that these people usually did not care about worldly affairs. For example, Taoist Ji Gong had always been cultivating in his cave. He was a person who was extremely afraid of trouble, but after receiving the order from Ji Lu and the others, he could not refuse. Fortunately, it was just a trip, and not a fight, so he could reluctantly accept it. After leaving the mountain, in a flash, he arrived in front of Yanlu Kingdom. He used his technique to look at qi, but after cultivating for a long time, he only saw a turbid cloud above him. He could not see anything clearly, so he guessed that it was covered by a spell or some talisman. He could not help but feel troubled. If he wanted to see it clearly, he would have to sneak into the kingdom. However, he felt that he could not enter, or else it would be hard for him to come out. He hesitated for a while, but he turned around and left. He trusted his intuition. If he returned without any results, he would only be scolded, but if he took the risk, he might lose his life. He prided himself on the fact that it was not easy to cultivate, so he would not do something so dangerous. Not long after he left, Yiguang, Qingguang, and Xiuguang appeared in the sky above Yanlu Kingdom. Xiuguang said, "Senior apprentice brother, why did you not ask me to stop him?" Yiguang said, "This person has not entered the 11th prince's kingdom, so it is not reasonable to kill him. He did not see anything, so let him be." Qingguang said coldly, "Senior apprentice brother, since the 2 sides are enemies, then there is no need to care. If we can kill one, then we will have less trouble in the future." Yiguang smiled and said, "Junior apprentice brother, since it is a battle between 2 Taoist lineages, then it is not a temporary victory, but a long-term consideration. This person is insignificant in Zik Mountain. If I were to attack him, I would be forcing him to make things difficult for me, and Quan Dao would only take advantage of me." Qingguang said, "What if he really comes to fight?" Yiguang said, "Then I will naturally fight back with all my strength. It is not my style to sit and wait for death." However, the founding master has his own arrangements. I believe that Quan Dao will not have time to find trouble with me. Great Zhou Shishang said. Suddenly, Dandy Guang felt something, and after some calculations, he walked out of the cultivation area and went to where Yin Kuang was. When the servant at the door saw him, he did not stop him and allowed him to enter. Yin Kuang was studying the heavenly talisman, and when he saw him, he kept the talisman and said, "Daoist Dandy Guang, is there anything?" Dandy Guang said directly, "There is a matter that requires the left imperial censor's help." Yin Kuang knew that since he wanted the Grand Elder to support him, he had to listen to the Grand Elder's instructions in certain aspects. This was unavoidable, and he did not think that he would be completely independent, so he said, "Please speak." Dandy Guang said, "Ask the left imperial censor to send people to attack second Prince Hao Ji." Yin Kuang did not ask for the reason, but said in a deep voice, "Daoist priest should know that if I do this, I will be going against the Dao behind him." Dandy Guang said, "If the Grand Elder's subordinates come, I will personally deal with them, and I will not make things difficult for the left imperial censor." Yin Kuang asked again, "But what if the Grand Elder comes personally?" After all, he was once the left imperial censor, so he knew that before the truth of the fight for the throne came to light, the Grand Elder would definitely not show up. At most, he would send his disciples down the mountain to protect and assist him. This was because if the fight for the throne was decided by the Grand Elder, then the Dao vein would be completely above the celestial court. Due to certain reasons, the Grand Elders would not take the initiative to cross this boundary. However, he was not a prince. After betraying the celestial court, he was just a traitor. If the Grand Elder took him down, the celestial court would only be happy to see that happen. Dandy Guang replied solemnly, "If the Grand Elder takes action, the implications are too great. It is hard for I to promise. However, if this really happens, you can place the heavenly talisman in my forgotten mountain. When the time is right, I will send it to your disciple, and he will inherit the talisman to carry on your unfinished work." Yin Kuang understood that if he wanted to kill the gods and overthrow the celestial court, he would definitely go against the Tao of virtue. Therefore, after rebelling against the celestial court, he did not care about his life anymore. What he needed to do now was to pave the way for his disciple. Dandy Guang's words were a promise to him that he would continue to support his disciple. Since this was the case, he had nothing to worry about. He immediately agreed, "All right, let's do this. Tomorrow, I will send people to attack Apricot Continent." Chapter 1914. Although Yin Kuang had agreed to attack the second prince's fief, he would not do so directly. Instead, he sent some people to the fief and tried to convince some of the second prince's loyal Qi practitioners to be his spies. When the second prince had first arrived at his fief, he had tried to hunt down all the cultivators in his fief. Those who were willing to obey him were all under his command. Those who were unwilling, he used the golden seal that the Heavenly Mother had bestowed upon them to break into their sect and slaughter them all. Most of these cultivators had been forced to sign the contract and could only listen to the second prince's orders. However, the second prince treated them like slaves, scolding and punishing them at every turn. It was only because of the contract that they could not resist unless they wanted their lives. Thus, although they were obedient on the surface, they hated the second prince to the core. Now that Yin Kuang had come, he said that he could help them solve this problem. Those contracts were made by the Tao of virtue. If they simply dissolved them, they would definitely be found out. However, he had the heavenly talisman. As long as he wrote the name of the person who had made the oath on it, the heavenly talisman would be able to withstand the power of the oath. When the cultivators heard this, they were very excited. If they could really get rid of the contract, they would be able to go anywhere in the world. Thus, most of them expressed that they were willing to be spies. However, there were still some who were wary of the Tao of virtue and did not dare to betray him. Fortunately, Yin Kuang did not ask for too much. He stated that if they were unwilling, they only needed to swear not to divulge this matter and he would not make things difficult for them. After deciding on the plan to expel the 11th prince from Zeke Mountain, a letter was sent to the Apricot Continent. The Taoist in charge of supporting the second prince was called Chang He. After receiving the letter, he immediately went to look for the second prince, Hao Kuang. He also stated the intentions of the sect. Hao Kuang was puzzled by this action and asked, "Attack the 11th prince first. Why is that?" He had never taken this 11th prince seriously. Even when the 7th prince's fief had been expelled, he did not feel that this 11th prince posed any threat. His target had always been the 3rd prince, who also had the support of the Grand Supreme. Even if he did not consider this, the Yanlu nation was too far away. Even if he rode on the clouds, a round trip would be enough for his brothers to attack his fief. There was no threat, and there was no benefit in attacking. Then why did he do it? Chang Ha said solemnly, "Your Highness, the sect has already confirmed that the 11th Highness has most likely gotten help from the Forgottenly Mountain." Hao Jin was surprised at first, then he suddenly understood. He laughed and said, "I was wondering why he suddenly became so powerful. So this is the reason." He showed a look of disdain. "I was thinking that since he was able to expel 7th brother, he must have some ability. It turns out that he relied on external help." Chang He couldn't help but be stunned. He didn't know where this person's arrogance came from. Wasn't it all because of their virtue that he was able to sit here today? Why was it that the 11th imperial prince had the support of the Grand Elder but was looked down upon instead? He couldn't figure out what this crown prince was thinking, so he shook his head and decided not to pursue the matter. He just advised, "The 11th prince is different from before. After all, there is a Grand Supreme standing behind him. Your Highness can't be underestimated. You have to expel him as soon as possible." Hao Jin said, "If that's the case, then my 3rd brother should be anxious too. Why don't we wait for him to show up? That way, we can take advantage of the situation." Chang He said seriously, "This is exactly what I wanted to say to your Highness. The Forgottenly Mountain might have colluded with the whole Taoism. We can't face 2 opponents at the same time. We can only take advantage of the current situation to eliminate the weaker side first. Then we can fight against the 3rd prince." Hao Jin became slightly nervous when he heard this, but he was still unwilling. He suspected that Chang He said this on purpose because he wanted his permission. So he waved his hand and said, "This is only Taoist priest's guess. It may not be true. If it is not true, then my 3rd brother will be the fisherman for no reason. This is absolutely impossible." Chang He saw that he was unwilling inside. He could only give up and said, "This matter was decided by Uncle Ji Yu. I can't disobey. If your Highness thinks it is inappropriate, you can go to the Zeke Mountain and talk about it." Hao Jin's expression changed slightly. After what happened last time, he knew that he couldn't leave the Tao of morality. He said reluctantly, "So it was decided by the 3 Taoist priests. How can I oppose it?" Chang He, Taoist priest, please go ahead. Chang He shook his head in his heart. He wanted to speak nicely, but this person could only force him. There was no way to reason with him. If he knew this would happen, he wouldn't have wasted so much time talking. He bowed and said, "I will go with Uncle Ji Quan. If everything goes smoothly, we can return in one night. However, after we leave, your Highness must not rashly go to battle. Just guard your fief well and stay in the forbidden formation." Hao Jin said, as Taoist priest said. After Chang He came out from Hao Jin's place, he immediately went to a temple. He bowed to the Taoist sitting there and said, "Uncle Ji Quan, I have agreed with the 11th prince." Taoist Ji Quan said, "Good. Go and call your fellow disciples over. We will depart now." Chang He obeyed and left. Not long after, a total of 5 Taoists arrived. Ji Quan looked at them. These people were either his disciples or his juniors. However, they had cultivated for about the same amount of time as him. Disregarding seniority, their cultivation level was similar to his. He said, "Your Highness, we can't afford to make any mistakes here. Are you all ready?" One of the Taoists said, "Uncle Ji Quan, the forbidden formation has been set up. Even if all the Taoists attacked, it would be able to hold them off for 2 to 4 hours. We can still make it back in time. Ji Quan made a sound of acknowledgement. Since the arrangements had been made, there was no need to delay any further. Just as he was about to get up, an attendant rushed in from outside. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "What's the matter?" The servant quickly bowed and said, reporting to the Taoist priests. "The demon soldiers in the south camp are in chaos. The third prince has invited a Taoist priest to suppress them." Ji Quan snorted and said, "They are still beasts." These demon soldiers had never been restrained and would cause trouble every now and then. The second prince had no choice but to rely on them every time to suppress them. He used a spell and observed the situation. Indeed, in a large camp in the south, the demon soldiers were fighting each other. It was no different from before. The demon soldiers that were sent to keep an eye on the demon soldiers were nowhere to be seen. It was obvious what had happened to them. He immediately pointed at 2 disciples with decent cultivation levels and said, "Go and suppress the chaos. Come back quickly." The 2 disciples bowed and left with the order. Ji Quan originally thought that this was a small matter. Moreover, it was not the first time that these 2 disciples had done this. He believed that it would not take long for them to settle this. However, after a long time, the commotion did not die down. Instead, it became louder and louder. He looked again and realized that he could not see through it. It was obvious that someone was hiding it. Not good. He immediately reacted, and with a thought, he was already in the sky above. He found that all the demon soldiers here were gone, and only the 2 disciples he sent earlier were still here. However, at this moment, their fontanelle was suppressed by talismans, and they could not move. His face darkened. He descended and waved his sleeves to get rid of the talismans. He said, "What happened?" The 2 disciples couldn't tell what was going on. They just saw a red light flash when they arrived, and then they lost consciousness. Ji Quan could not help but furrow his brows. A ray of light flashed in his eyes, and the scene he had just experienced was reflected in front of him. Only then did he understand everything. It turned out that the ones causing trouble here were not the monster soldiers, but the Qi practitioners. He couldn't help but be surprised. These Qi practitioners had all signed a contract, and it was impossible for them to undo it by themselves. Then, there must be someone helping them from behind, and that person must be quite capable. At the very least, he couldn't do it. Then, he tried to calculate the whereabouts of the Qi practitioners, and found that the whereabouts of the Qi practitioners were also concealed. He realized that there were enemies watching in the dark. He became alert and returned to the temple. He immediately reported this matter to the higher-ups and requested for more manpower. However, Zeke Mountain rejected the request and asked him to handle the aftermath himself. This was because the Virtue sect and the Quan Dao sect were wary of each other, so the number of disciples they sent to the lower domain was roughly the same. If one side suddenly sent more manpower, the other side would also send more disciples to prevent themselves from being suppressed by the other side. However, if more disciples were to come, the Quan Dao sect would easily misunderstand the situation. If it was not good, the 2 sects would fight each other prematurely. Ji Quan felt helpless when he received the reply from the mountain gate. He could not ignore the 3rd prince's fief. After all, it was more important. Thus, he could only put aside his original plan to deal with the 11th prince. In the following days, under Yin Kuang's control, many demon soldier camps in Qingtai continent were in chaos. This made Ji Quan even more afraid to leave without permission. The 2nd prince, Hao Kuei, did not want Ji Quan to attack the Yanlu kingdom. Now that he had this excuse, he became even more passive and did nothing for half a year. As for the 11th prince, he took this opportunity to attack again. He destroyed another prince's fief, and the 3rd prince did the same. At this point, 8 princes had been expelled from the fight for the throne. Now, only the 1st prince, Hao Qi, 2nd prince, Hao Kuei, 3rd prince, Hao Chang, and the 11th prince, Hao Neng, were still in the game. The 1st prince's identity was special. If he could sit on the throne, there would not be so many problems. Thus, if there were no accidents, one of Hao Kuei, Hao Chang, and Hao Neng would be able to ascend to the throne in the future. Each of these three had a Taishang Dao ancestor behind them. However, due to certain reasons, although the three sects could intervene, they could not do everything for them. Thus, the princes still had to rely on their own strength to decide the outcome. At this time, Zhang Yan received a letter from Quan Dao. It was an invitation from the two Taishang Daoists. He understood that the discussion was fake. They wanted to continue the topic they had not finished before, and they also wanted to discuss how to deal with the Dao. He summoned the disciples and said, I have been invited by the two Daoists, Quan Dao, to discuss the Dao. All of you, guard the mountain gate. After giving his instructions, he waved his sleeves and left the forgotten mountain, heading towards the agreed place. Chapter 1915. Zhang Yan left Mount Liwang. With a change of heart, he arrived at an indescribable place. There was a cloud platform golden residence here, and it was the place where Quan Dao decided to discuss Dao this time. The reason why they didn't meet in Quan Dao's mountain gate was probably because they didn't want the Dao to find out that they were related to each other. However, this matter couldn't be hidden for long. Therefore, he thought that the deeper reason here was that Quan Dao and De Dao had never treated him as one of their own. It was only to deal with De Dao that they had to include him in their group. When the common target was eliminated, they definitely wouldn't be as polite to him as before. He didn't care about such small details. After De Dao and Zhuo Dao were expelled, he would also deal with them. As long as both of them had the same goal before that, it wouldn't be a problem. At this moment, the palace door opened. He waved his sleeves and entered the inner room. The two Daoists were sitting in the room. When they saw him, they stood up and greeted, Greetings, Daoist friend. Zhang Yan looked over. The one sitting on the right was the Daoist who came to visit Mount Liwang previously, while the other was sitting on the left. It seemed like both of them were equally matched. Although the two Daoists had sage-like appearances, in his eyes, their faces and figures were blurry and not very clear. This was because the two of them were only formed by a strand of consciousness that entered this world. Outsiders didn't know the details, but in the eyes of his peers, he saw something wrong, which was why he behaved like this. However, before the real body arrived, he didn't have to care about the real body. At this moment, he still had to return the greeting. The Daoist on the left said, Daoist friend, please take a seat. Zhang Yan smiled and nodded. He sat on a cattail hassock in front of him. The three of them were Taishang, so they didn't have to be polite. The Daoist on the left said directly, the princes have been fighting for years, and the situation is already clear. Today, I invited you here to discuss the matter of joining forces to fight against De Dao. Zhang Yan, do you two have any countermeasures? The Daoist continued, virtue and Dao are strong, and with the addition of me, in the past battles, they always suppressed me. Now that our two families are working together, we are barely able to resist the enemy. The Daoist on the left said, according to the agreement, if I win the fight for the throne, I will enter the main hall and the Daoist of virtue will enter the side hall. However, this person has been holding on to that item for a long time and his mind has wandered off to unknown places. If I don't win this time, once the true body of the heavens arrives, we will be banished from this world. Only by asking for your full strength will we have a chance of winning. Zhang Yan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard something from this person's words. It seemed that as long as this person had that thing in his hand, it was extremely likely that he would be able to use it to attract the attention of his main body. If that was the case, then he had to overthrow the morality as soon as possible. However, because the two families had already made an agreement, even if virtue was defeated this time, he would only step down from the position of the righteous faction and be transferred to the side hall. He would not be banished from the heavens. The fight for the position of the true body would obviously continue. This was not what he wanted. Hence, once he defeated this person, he had to think of a way to get rid of him no matter what. Only then could he turn around and deal with Quan Dao. He said, I will naturally do my best to help. The Daoist on the left said, after the Dao of virtue is banished, as long as you respect my name, Quan Dao, you will be on the same level as me in the main hall of the heavenly court. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He had already understood what these two people meant. Even if Quan Daozhen managed to become the righteous faction after this battle, De Dao would still try to fight for his position after he retired. In that case, it would be quite difficult for the two of them to defend the righteous faction. Only with him would they be able to defend the righteous faction. However, this did not mean that there was no need to fight for the succession of the 11th prince and the 3rd prince. This was because it might involve the right to control that thing. Regardless of whether it was Quan Dao or the Dao of Virtue, there might be an agreement between the lineages. However, it was different for him. He had never had any dealings with this person. In fact, he even tried his best to avoid meeting him. Hence, if he could not obtain this thing, it would be useless even if he was placed on the main hall. Hence, he would definitely not give up on this place. However, no one mentioned who should obtain the position of the emperor this time. This was because there was no need to make a decision now. They could discuss it after Virtue was overthrown. Furthermore, if Virtue was not eliminated, there was no point in discussing this for the time being. Instead, it would ruin the harmony between them. Due to Yin Kuang's repeated disturbances in the Apricot continent, there was no peace in the recent days. At first, Second Prince Hao Qiu did not think much of it. He thought that it was only a small problem. However, he gradually felt that something was wrong. This was actually a big problem. This caused him to be trapped in his own fief. He could not boldly attack others. If his other brothers, such as the 3rd prince, attacked him at this time, it would be hard to guarantee that his backyard would not be stable. On this day, Chang He came to Hao Qiu's residence after reporting his arrival. When he saw Hao Qiu's face, he said, "The matter that His Highness entrusted to I has been investigated." Hao Qiu's spirit was lifted. He asked anxiously, "Priest, tell me quickly, who is it that is plotting against me?" Chang He replied, "This matter should be secretly done by the former left imperial minister of the heavenly court, Yin Kuang." Hao Qiu was shocked. Left imperial minister? Zhou imperial minister was originally a trusted follower of the heaven sovereign. Even though Hao Qiu was a prince, he did not dare to put on airs in front of this person. The two of them could be said to have no grudges against each other. Hence, Hao Qiu was puzzled. He asked, "Why would he want to deal with my family?" Chang He said, "Perhaps he was roped in by the other princes, or perhaps he was bewitched by someone else." Hao Qiu cursed inwardly. He said irritably, "How should we deal with this?" He might look down on his other brothers, but he did not dare to underestimate this dignified and resolute Zhou imperial minister. Not to mention, this Zhou imperial minister still had the heavenly talisman in his hands. This item was refined by the Grand Supreme to display the authority of the heaven sovereign. It could be said that the person who wielded the heavenly talisman was no weaker than the heaven sovereign. Now, even if the star sovereigns led their troops to attack him, they would not be able to deal with him. Moreover, the heavenly talisman's karma was too great. If it was used too much, the master would not have a good ending. However, the heavenly court and the various worlds would also be implicated. Hence, unless it was absolutely necessary, no one was willing to provoke it. He looked at Chang He and asked, "Can the Grand Supreme take back this item?" Chang He shook his head. When the Grand Supreme entrusted the heavenly talisman to the heaven sovereign, he said that no matter who has this item in the future, he will not interfere with it. Hao Qiu was stunned. "Is there such a thing?" Chang He nodded. The reason why Yin Kuang was able to steal the heavenly talisman was because of De Dao's secret push. Hence, when Yin Kuang first descended to the lower bound, De Dao still had many ways to retrieve the heavenly talisman. However, Celestial Emperor still refused to appoint a successor to the throne, so De Dao let him be. But now that so much time had passed, Yin Kuang must have mastered the various uses of the heavenly talisman. Even if Zhi Lu and the other two joined forces, they might not be able to do anything to him. Moreover, if they really did that, Yin Kuang could escape with the heavenly talisman even if he couldn't stop them. Hao Qiu was frustrated. Then what should we do? Should we let this person continue to disturb us? Chang He thought about it and said, "Don't panic, Your Highness. You can't use force to deal with such a person. You can only use your wits. What the other princes can give, second prince can also give and even more. Why don't you give him a title and promise to pardon his crimes after you ascend the throne? Perhaps, you can even make him work for us. At least, he can live in peace." When Hao Qiu heard this, he felt that it made sense. If imperial advisors is willing to work for me, what's wrong with pardoning his crimes? But the heavenly talisman belongs to the imperial family, so it must be returned. Chang He quickly said, "Your Highness, it's better not to mention this now. Otherwise, it won't be good." Hao Qiu snorted in dissatisfaction. But he knew that this suggestion was correct. He immediately found a trusted aide and ordered him to write a letter on his behalf and send it to the Zhou kingdom. Ying Kuang had been paying attention to every movement in Qingtai continent. Not long after this letter was sent, it reached his hands. Based on the content of the letter, it wasn't difficult to see that the other party already knew that it was him. But this was only a matter of time, so he didn't take it to heart. After reading it, he pondered for a moment and ordered someone to invite Dongguang over. He handed the letter to the latter and said, "Daoist Dongguang, what do you think?" Dongguang put down the letter and smiled. Since second prince is so sincere in his invitation, imperial advisors might as well agree. But you need to grasp the key points well. Ying Kuang immediately understood his intention. Dongguang wanted him to pretend to agree. He nodded and said, "I understand." He immediately picked up his brush and wrote a letter. The meaning of the letter was that he was willing to submit, but the second prince was not to pursue the matter of the Qi practitioners who had submitted to him previously. After he finished writing, he handed the letter to Dongguang and said, "Daoist, please take a look." Dongguang didn't stand on ceremony. He took the letter and looked at it. He nodded and said, "Send it like this." A few days later, Hao Qiu received the letter. Seeing that Ying Kuang was willing to submit, he couldn't help but be overjoyed. He was very clear about the power of the heavenly talisman. With such a person helping him, his chances of winning the throne would be higher. As for the Qi practitioners, he didn't care about them at all, so he could easily agree. Thus, he proudly called Chang He over to show off. Chang He reminded him, "Your Highness, this person is not easy to control. You must be careful." Currently, they didn't have any Dharma oath that could bind Ying Kuang, who had the innate gift. Thus, they had to be wary of Ying Kuang pretending to submit to them. However, seeing that Hao Qiu was in high spirits, they couldn't say it out loud and could only advise him in a roundabout way. Hao Qiu looked at his expression and said with a faint smile, "Daoist, don't worry. Although I hope that this person will sincerely submit to me, I won't trust him so easily. I hope that Daoist can make a trip on my behalf to find out more about this person and ask him to help attack my third brother. There's no need to do anything else. Just repeat what you did on my fief a few days ago. All the expenses incurred during this period will be borne by my family." Chang He cupped his hands and said, "Your Highness is wise. I will go now. Even if this person has other plans, I can use this opportunity to find out more about him." Chapter 1916. Chang He had been asked by the second prince, Hao Jin, to go to the great Zhou dynasty. He had thought that he would need to negotiate with the second prince before he could achieve his goal. However, he did not expect that he would be able to meet Ying Kuang so easily. After some discussion, he tried to ask Ying Kuang to submit to the second prince. Ying Kuang said, "Taoist priest should know that I have a good relationship with your side. The second prince is indeed a candidate for the throne. What I did earlier was a request from someone else. Since Taoist priest has come to persuade me, I have no choice but to submit." Chang He said, "May I know who that person is?" Ying Kuang smiled and said, "Please forgive me for not being able to say it clearly." Chang He saw that he was unwilling to say it, so he did not force him and said, "Since the left imperial advisor is willing to submit to your highness, then I have a task that your highness personally instructed me to do." Ing Kuang said, Taoist priest, please speak. Chang He said, Left Imperial Advisor, use the same method that you used on Your Highness land on the 11th Prince. He had thought that Ing Kuang would try to shirk the responsibility or ask for more benefits, but to his surprise, Ing Kuang agreed immediately and said, Although I am willing to serve the second prince, I have not made any contributions yet. Since you want me to attack the 11th prince, I will use this as a stepping stone. Chang He looked satisfied when he heard this, but he did not really believe it. He found an excuse to stay, but in fact, he was watching Ing Kuang's every move. It was not important whether Ing Kuang would follow his instructions or not. The key was to make sure that Ing Kuang could not cause trouble for the second prince. Ing Kuang did not care. If he really wanted to do something, with the heavenly talisman in his hand, a disciple of virtue would not be able to stop him. In the blink of an eye, half a month passed. Chang He saw that Ing Kuang did not move, so he reminded him, Left Imperial Advisor, have you forgotten your promise? Ing Kuang said calmly, Taoist priest, please do not be impatient. The 11th prince is different from the second prince. He does not have any demon soldiers under him, and he is guarded by the overflowing water dragon clan. The rules are strict, and it is not easy to find a loophole. It has only been a few days, what can we see? Please wait patiently for a period of time. Chang He didn't believe his words, but the truth was as he said. He couldn't find any flaws in his words at the moment. However, his questioning this time was not really about this matter, but to observe the other person's attitude. If he still didn't get any results after a few times, it would mean that he was faking his allegiance, and there was no need to waste time here. After Zhang Yan and the two grand elders of Quan Dao came up with a plan to attack together, they returned to Li Wang Mountain and arranged for many disciples to go down to the lower bound. All of them went to the 11th prince. At the same time, Quan Dao also sent his disciples into the formation. De Dao had been watching Quan Dao the entire time. When he saw Quan Dao's actions, he immediately became alert. This was because it was time for the three families to fight for victory. In order not to be passive, he had also sent many of his disciples to the second prince's location. In the kingdom of Law, the 11th prince saw that many Daoist cultivators from Mount Li Wang had arrived and was very happy. Yi Guang suggested, Second prince's fief has been repeatedly disturbed by Ing Kuang previously and is now at its weakest. His defense is also lax. Why don't you attack now and seize the opportunity to take down a city? Haoning thought for a while and asked, Since I am working together with the third brother, should I inform him? Yi Guang said, Although I am working with Quan Dao, the third prince and your brother are not. Does the third prince understand? Haoning thought for a while and nodded, I understand Daoist's intention. Yi Guang said, Since I understand, there is no harm in informing him. However, the third prince may not come on time. Haoning said, I understand. That night, he gathered all his trusted aides, including Jiaying, to discuss the attack on Qingtai continent. The Qingtai continent was roughly divided into 6 counties. 4 of the counties were fertile lands where the celestials from the lower realm gathered. The other 2 counties were relatively barren and sparsely populated. Among them, the Hoyuan County was filled with mountains and forests. There were many birds and beasts here, making it easy for them to gather food. Thus, the second prince had placed most of the demon soldiers he had recruited here. He had also set up 4 camps along the border of the county. Most of Ing Kuang's previous attacks had been in these camps. Haoning, Jiaying, and the rest discussed and decided to attack this place first. The demon soldiers were unruly, and since the Qi practitioners were all recruited by Ing Kuang, they would not fail in a night attack. Moreover, once they occupied this place, it would not be easy for the second prince to gather the demon soldiers again. After the discussion, in order to end the battle quickly and avoid the second prince's detection, the Yanlu kingdom prepared for half a day. They gathered 50,000 soldiers and more than 100 Qi practitioners. Led by Haoning himself, they rode on the wind and clouds and crossed several boundaries in one night to attack Hoyuan County. As expected, the demon soldiers were not prepared for the sudden attack and were immediately defeated. After taking down one of the camps, they continued to attack the other boundaries. In just one night, they had taken down 4 camps. When the second prince heard the news, he thought of sending reinforcements. However, Haoneng had sent many Qi practitioners to block the way, so they could not go over. When the next day came, they saw that the battle was over and that there was no point in continuing to fight, so they retreated. When the second prince heard about this, he was furious. At the same time, he was a little flustered. The few people who failed to save the demon soldiers were all killed by the magical treasure given by the Heavenly Mother. At the same time, he asked someone to invite Ji Quan over to discuss the matter. Ji Quan was already aware of this and said calmly, "Your Highness, please do not be angry. Let me try." Hao Quan calmed down and said, "Thank you, Taoist." Ji Quan made up his mind. With this thought, the clouds in the sky changed color and formed a storm that pressed down on Hoyuan County. At this moment, Hao Kuei was standing in the original campsite. He had set up a temporary imperial residence on a small hill. Looking at the thick dark clouds coming from afar, he took a deep breath and ordered his subordinates, "Quickly invite Taoist Yi here." Taoist Yi Guang arrived not long after. Seeing the change in the sky, he smiled and said, "This is just a small Taoist." He blew gently and a gust of clear air shot up into the sky. The clouds dispersed and the rain stopped. The sky was clear again. Hao Quan relaxed and cupped his hands. "Taoist Yi Guang, thank you." Taoist Yi Guang smiled and said, "No need to thank me. This is a fight for the throne, not a fight for my Taoist skills. The 11th prince, with you here, the other side will not dare to use any powerful skills. At most, they will use some small Taoist skills to move mountains and rivers. If they come again, I will deal with them. However, if the prince is defeated, I will not be able to save you." Hao Quan nodded and said, "Taoist Yi Guang only needs to block those skills. I will deal with the rest." Ji Quan realized that his Taoist skills were broken. He calculated and said coldly, "There are people from Mount Li Wang." Hao Quan asked nervously, "Can Taoist Yi Guang win?" Ji Quan shook his head and said, "This is not the key. You two are fighting for the throne. Even if I have Taoist skills, I will not be able to use them too much. He is hiding in the camp and I will not be able to hurt him." Hao Quan said, "Then what should we do?" In fact, he had many capable men under him. He should not have to ask De Dao for advice. However, most of these men were sent by Heavenly Mother Quan and they also had the responsibility of supervising him. Every time he did something wrong, these men would report back and Heavenly Mother Quan would send a letter to reprimand him. As time went by, he became more and more dissatisfied with these men. Even if there were difficulties, he would not ask them. Instead, he would discuss with De Dao more often because these Taoists never cared about what he did. This situation was something that De Dao was happy to see. Ji Quan smiled and said, "If the 11th prince is hiding in Yanlu Kingdom, we will not be able to do anything to him. However, he overestimated himself and came here. He is walking right into a trap. This will help the second prince achieve his goal." Hao Quan was surprised and said, "Oh. Taoist Yi Guang, do you have any ideas?" Ji Quan said, "The 11th prince was able to cross the realm and come here because of the Qi practitioners, cloud soaring art. However, as long as we can get rid of these people, he will not be able to go back. Once he loses his path of retreat, his soldiers will lose their will to fight and he will definitely lose. Your Highness can then get rid of an opponent here." Hao Quan asked curiously, "But didn't Taoist Yi Guang say that you can't do anything to him?" Ji Quan said, "That is only because it involves the fight for the throne. It is not my place to exert my power here. However, I can use the excuse of sparring to challenge the Li Wang mountain cultivator to a battle. Once he is gone, the Qi practitioners below will not be difficult to deal with." Hao Quan thought for a moment and said, "But what if he refuses?" Ji Quan laughed and stroked his beard, "I have my ways, your Highness need not ask any more." This time, he planned to tempt him with benefits. They were both under the supreme sect, so he didn't lack any cultivation items, so he couldn't use this kind of thing. However, he could have a bet with the other party, and the loser would have to leave this place. He was the strongest cultivator here. If he lost the battle, then the 11th prince's side would have a huge advantage. Hence, the 11th prince would most likely not give up on this opportunity. But even if he lost the battle, there were still many juniors here who were close to him. Even if he left, the overall strength of the group would not be affected much. After he returned, he sent a messenger to deliver the letter of challenge to the camp of the 11th prince. As Hao Ning heard of this, he asked Yi Guang to come closer and asked, "Is Daoist Yi Guang going to the battle?" Yi Guang smiled and said, "Since there is a letter of challenge, of course I have to go. Otherwise, wouldn't it seem like I am afraid of him? If I spread the news, it would be detrimental to the morale of the group." Hao Ning asked worriedly, "Are you confident?" Yi Guang replied, "Don't worry, Prince. Whether I win or lose, it will not affect the overall situation. You don't have to worry about me, just do what you have to do." He said meaningfully, "You have to know that it is not just my side against the second prince, but both sides. Even if there is no progress, there is no need to worry about not getting a chance." In the Mingtai continent, the third prince, Hao Chang, sat on the highest seat. He had a thick mustache and a calm expression. His mannerisms were well-mannered and he had the demeanor of an emperor. Now, he was discussing with his subordinates whether they should attack the Qingtai continent together with the 11th prince and attack the third prince. However, as soon as this suggestion was made, many people objected. They felt that it was not a good time to make a move. They wanted to wait for the 11th prince and the second prince to injure each other before attacking. Then, the throne would be in the bag. After careful consideration, Hao Chang still decided to rush over. It wasn't because he cared about morality, but because if the 11th prince didn't see him coming, he could just retreat and he would miss a great opportunity. Thus, he stood his ground and said, "Everyone, there is no need to say anything more. My second brother is just now a great enemy. We have agreed to attack the Qingtai continent together. I will not break my promise. Everyone, gather your men and follow me to the rescue." Chapter 1917. On the second day, Yi Guang was about to leave for the battle at Jiquan. Hao Ning personally sent him off and said solemnly, "Priest, you must be careful." Yi Guang smiled, "Thank you, Prince. I'm afraid it will take some time before I can return." "Prince, there is no need to wait. I have already informed my two fellow disciples. If you encounter any difficulties, you can ask them." Hao Ning nodded heavily. Yi Guang cupped his hands and said, "I will leave now. Prince, please return." He leaped up and stepped on a cloud, flying into the sky. Hao Ning looked up and disappeared in an instant. Qingguang suddenly said, "Jiquan is here." Everyone couldn't help but look over, but they didn't see anything. After a while, he said, "Senior Marshal Brother has already started fighting with this person." Hao Ning looked up and saw the wind and the sun. He was surprised, "How come there is no movement?" Qingguang said, "Senior Marshal Brother and Jiquan are both highly skilled. If they fight here, the sky will be turned upside down. Therefore, they have gone out of this world." Hao Ning nodded, "I hope Priest Yi Guang can return safely." Qingguang said, "Prince, don't worry. Even if Senior Marshal Brother cannot win, he will not lose." An official behind Hao Ning came up and said, "Your Highness, do you want to wait for Priest Yi Guang to finish the battle before marching?" Hao Ning waved his hand and said, "There is no need. Since Priest Yi Guang said it will not affect the overall situation, then there is no need to worry. Just follow the plan." Because the second prince's demon soldiers were all scattered by him, there were still some left, but they could only defend and could not come out to fight with him. Therefore, it was time for the army to advance. However, Hoyuan County needed to be secured. If they didn't have a stable base, they wouldn't be able to fly away. As such, this was their retreat route, and they couldn't afford to lose it. He placed two of his trusted subordinates here and asked Xiu Guang to stay here to protect them. After making all the necessary arrangements, he led over 40,000 soldiers and 100 Qi practitioners toward Qintai County in the Qingtai continent. He had quite a number of dragons and aquatic creatures under his command. Therefore, this time, he had to cross the river and move forward along the river. Along the way, he could see the flood dragons swimming under the water. The waves carried the whole army as they moved along the river. Above them, clouds and mist were rolling. The people on both sides of the river could only see a large amount of thick fog coming from upstream. From inside the fog, they could hear the sound of the rushing tide. However, in just a moment, they were already dozens of miles away. This river came from the west and meandered to the east, passing through the city gate of Qintai County. If everything went smoothly, they could use the power of the water to kill their way into the city. However, when the army reached this place, they stopped. This was because there were Qi practitioners who discovered that there was a 9-winding serpent array outside the city gate. If they were to run into it, they would either be trapped inside or be led somewhere else. There were a few choices here. They could either break through from here or attack from another city gate. However, there would definitely be a similar array there. Alternatively, they could take a detour around the city and head straight for the Qingtai continent, where the second prince lived in Yuhua Palace. Hao Ning stood on top of the tide and observed the situation for a while. He invited the crowd over to discuss and felt that it would not be difficult to break through the array. Moreover, he could use the water to his advantage. Therefore, he decided to break through from here. In the great Zhou dynasty's Shishang Dao, Chang He heard that Qingtai continent was being attacked by the 11th prince's army. At this moment, they were in a disadvantageous position. He immediately came to Yinkuang and said, "The 11th prince is attacking Qingtai continent. Now that the Yanyu kingdom is empty, the left imperial censor can disturb the rear and force them to retreat." Yinkuang said, "Does Daoist priest not want me to go to Qingtai continent to help the 11th prince?" Chang He said anxiously, "Attacking is the best way to save them." Yinkuang said, "Very well, then I will listen to Daoist priest and go to the Yanyu kingdom." He did not want to reveal too much of his strength. Therefore, after making arrangements for his subordinates, he only brought a few dozen Qi practitioners and flew away. When they were in the sky, someone asked, "Left imperial censor, are you going to the Yanyu kingdom?" Yinkuang sneered and said, "What Yanyu kingdom? We are going to the Qingtai continent." The second prince was the most favored person by Daoist priest and the Heavenly Mother. He was most likely to inherit the Heavenly Monarch's throne. Therefore, he had to get rid of him no matter what. Now that such a good opportunity was presented to him, how could he miss it? As for hiding it from Chang He, it was easy. He just needed to use the heavenly talisman to conceal himself. At the same time, Zhang Yan also sensed something in Mount Li Wang and immediately knew Yinkuang's intention. He smiled and changed his mind. He also cast a spell to conceal the heavenly secret. Although Daoist priest would notice it sooner or later, he could delay it. By the time Daoist priest reacted, Yinkuang would have already reached the Qingtai continent for a long time. Chang He watched Yinkuang leave and felt relieved. Originally, he wanted to follow Yinkuang. However, after considering that he might be monitoring Yinkuang, he was afraid that Yinkuang would be displeased. Usually, it would not be a problem, but now, it was not a good time to do so. However, not long after, he received another piece of bad news. What? The third prince is attacking the Qingtai continent. Chang He's expression changed. The third prince was a much bigger threat than the 11th prince. The latter was only a temporary threat, while the third prince was the real contender for the throne. He could not help but regret. Just now, instead of persuading Yinkuang to go to the 11th prince's place, he could have asked him to attack the third prince's fief. Then, he might have been able to resolve this dangerous situation. Thinking about the two families attacking the Qingtai continent together, the second prince's forces might not be able to hold them off. He did not want to stay here any longer. He immediately used his escape technique and returned to where he came from. 2 days later, Qintai city was breached, and the 11th prince had occupied this place. Not only did he have a stable foothold, but he also did not have to worry about his back. He could now choose any place to attack. When second Prince Hao Ji heard the news, he did not have time to be angry. However, when he heard that the third Prince Hao Chang was attacking the Qingtai continent, he was shocked and afraid. He did not know if the two families had planned this beforehand, or if it was just a spur-of-the-moment decision. However, he felt that the situation was not good. Moreover, all the demon soldiers that he could use had been sent to the front lines to retake Qintai city. There was no one else he could use, so how could he deal with the other family? Now that Ji Quan and Yi Guangdou Zhan had not returned, he quickly invited all the remaining virtuous Qi practitioners in the palace. He said, "My third brother is leading a group of people to invade my fief. They will soon reach my fief. At that time, the two families will attack together. Can Taoist priest go to the Purple Fault Mountain and ask for more perfected immortals to help us?" A Taoist stood up and said, "Your Highness, the sect is aware of the situation here. In the next few days, there will be many people from the same sect arriving." Hao Chu was overjoyed, but before he could rejoice, the Taoist said, "It should not be the Taoist sect's people who are fighting against the demon soldiers. Otherwise, the Heavenly Emperor will not show up. Even if your Highness wins this battle, you may not be able to ascend to the throne. In fact, since the third prince was here, he must be fully prepared. There must be many people from the Taoist sect accompanying him. Even if they were to attack, they would not be able to do anything. Instead, they would have to worry about being targeted by the third prince. Only by waiting for their fellow disciples to arrive would they have a chance of winning." When Hao Chu heard this, he was a little dissatisfied and said, "Then what should we do now?" The Taoist said, "Just guard the palace." Hao Chu was not satisfied with this answer. He snorted and left with a flick of his sleeves. When he returned to the palace, a trusted aide came to him and suggested, "Your Highness, there are actually more than enough soldiers in the continent to deal with the joint attack of the two families." Hao Chu was stunned and asked, "Where will the soldiers come from?" The trusted aide said, "Your Highness, have you forgotten that there are still many people in the continent? When the Heavenly Mother told the Emperor to assign Your Highness to this continent, she had this intention in mind. Your Highness is already in an invincible position." Hao Chu thought for a moment and immediately understood. His people were actually the true gods in the fief. Although they did not occupy the position of true god, in order to protect themselves, they had a large number of private soldiers. There were even demon soldiers that had been trained for a long time. If they were to be gathered now, they would be able to form an army in an instant. Then, it would be much easier to defend against the joint attack of the two families. However, he was a little hesitant. Although he did not have a clear understanding of the general situation, he was very familiar with the matters of his own people. The reason why he was able to secure his position was because of the worship from the true gods. However, at the same time, he had to protect this generation. Not only did he fail to do so, but he also wanted to expropriate their private property. This generation would definitely be against it and might even complain to the Heavenly Mother. This would not be beneficial to his future rule of this continent. The trusted aide understood this logic and said in a low voice, "Your Highness, let's deal with the current crisis first. You can promise them that you will compensate them later." Hao Chu was annoyed and said, "But where do I get the money to compensate them?" The trusted aide said, "When Your Highness becomes the Heavenly Emperor, are you afraid that you won't be able to pay them back? At this critical moment, you can ask the Heavenly Mother to lend you some. I believe she will give it to you." Hao Chu's spirit was lifted when he heard this. Indeed, if he could defeat the two families, he would almost be the next Heavenly Emperor. Why should he care about such a small profit? After coming up with a countermeasure, he immediately acted accordingly. As he promised that he would repay all the debts he owed after the war, the true gods did not have any dissatisfaction. Even if the second prince did not repay them by then, they could ask the Heavenly Mother for it. Therefore, another army quickly gathered under the palace. He immediately ordered his men to split into two groups. One group was responsible for defending against the third prince, Hao Chang, while the other group was responsible for defending against Hao Ning's aggressive attacks. At this moment, the trusted aide suggested again, "This battle is in your highness's territory. If this drags on, it will be disadvantageous to your highness." However, the third prince and the 11th prince have come from afar. Their resources are 10 times more than ours. Moreover, the country is empty. If we disturb them a little, we will be able to force them back. Hao Chu said, "I can only defend now. How can I do this?" The trusted aide said, "Your highness can send a messenger to persuade the people outside of your territory. As long as you promise them enough benefits, it will be fine." Hao Chu felt that it was very reasonable. Although he couldn't call upon the clansmen who weren't on his fiefdom, if they were willing to serve him, no one could say anything. He said, "During critical moments, it is still our own people who are reliable. These virtuous cultivators are not of the same mind as me. I cannot rely on them too much." Chapter 19:18. Just as the 11th prince took down Qintai city, Yin Kuang and the rest of the Qi practitioners had already arrived in the skies above the apricot Tai continent. His main goal was to kill the second prince, Hao Ji. This was Xian Tian Xianguang's request, but it was also his own goal. The second imperial prince was not only the son of the heavenly monarch and the heavenly mother, but he was also closely related to the Tao of virtue. As long as he was killed, there would definitely be more variables in the battle for the throne, which would be beneficial to the people below. However, he also knew that his actions would definitely incur the wrath of the heavenly court. They would definitely send divine generals and star lords to suppress him. However, he had already made up his mind. As long as the heavenly talisman was still in his hands, he would kill as many of these people as they came. He would try his best to weaken the strength of the heavenly court before the heavenly talisman left him, paving the way for his disciple to replace him in the future. Moreover, this was the time when the princes were vying for the throne. If the arrangements were made properly, it was highly possible that the foundation of the heavenly court would be shaken. At this moment, a Qi practitioner came from afar. When he got close, he stopped and bowed. He said, "Left imperial censor, the palace is heavily guarded. I can only watch from afar." At this moment, there are at least 2 perfected immortals of the Tao of virtue protecting the second prince. Even if his territory is attacked, they will be able to escort him out. Yin Kuang pondered for a moment and realized that this was a tricky situation. It was not that he was afraid of the 2 of them, but he could not kill them in an instant. In that case, he would not be able to stop them from escaping with the second prince unless he could lure them away. Unfortunately, Wang Guang didn't come along this time. Otherwise, he could ask for his help. He thought to himself, "Now I can only continue to wait. As long as these 2 people are held back by Quan Dao or the people of Forgotten Li Mountain, then there will be a chance." At the east of Qintai continent, at this moment, smoke and dust covered the sun. On top of the dust, there were more than 100,000 soldiers. Hao Chang was standing on top of a dragon chariot, the top of the chariot was covered, and on his left and right were his trusted aides. This time, he had led his troops to attack from the east of Qintai continent. His first target was one of the 6 counties, Xianglan County. However, he had met with strong resistance and his advance had not been very smooth. But on the surface, he didn't look anxious at all. Instead, he looked like he was confident of his victory. At this moment, a servant flew over on a cloud and reported, "Just as your highness expected, the second prince has indeed summoned his people to defend against them. These people are even more powerful than the demons, and it will be difficult for us to defeat them." Hao Chang said with a pleasant countenance, "You have worked hard, you and your clansmen have been working hard for a long time, go and rest first." He also took care of the servants and rewarded them with some good things. The attendant was extremely grateful and said, "Thank you for your understanding, your highness." After Hao Chang dismissed the man, his gaze became profound. He had come here not only to expel the second prince, but also to weaken his forces. Most of the gods in Qintai state were from the same race as Heavenly Mother Turtle. This generation was a huge problem, and if he could get rid of some of them, there would be fewer obstacles for him when he ascended the throne. Moreover, he had another worry. Even if his elder brother failed and was expelled from the fief, it was very likely that the heavenly turtle mother would bring him up again. This was not impossible, because it was the celestial thearch's idea to confer the princes to the lower realm, and the heavenly mother had never said a word about it. Moreover, as long as Dedao did not give up on his second brother, there was still a chance for him to rise from the ashes. The best way was to directly end his elder brother's life. However, this matter could not be done by him, because if he wanted to inherit the throne, there could not be a single stain on him. It would be best if the stain was on someone else or his 11th brother, then it would be the best of both worlds. Just as he was thinking, there was a sudden rumble in the sky. It was like thunder, but also like the beating of a drum. He could not help but look up and vaguely see a few Taoists standing above, surrounded by countless lightning bolts. Someone below exclaimed, "It's Dedao, perfected immortal." Compared to the obvious fear of the people around him, Hao Chang was very calm. He turned around and said to the two Taoists beside him, "I'll have to ask the two Taoists to take action." The two Taoists returned the greeting, and one of them said, "Of course, it should be me." As soon as he finished speaking, he leaped into the sky and fought with the newcomers. Although the two Taoists tried their best to bring the enemies away, there was still a continuous rain of fire falling from the sky. However, they were all blocked by a layer of light from the formation, and none of them landed on the heads of the Taoists. Hao Chang did not seem to be worried about the outcome of the battle. He did not look up anymore and ordered his men to continue attacking the city. With the soldiers provided by the deities, second Prince Hao Ji was barely able to deal with the attacks from both sides. However, he could only defend himself, and it was almost impossible for him to counterattack. He was also very worried about this. The Xianglan county that the third prince was attacking was mostly swampy, and there were not many people there. It was a place where the deities raised the toad and snake monsters to refine medicine. It was only slightly better than Hoyuan County, but its location was very important. If they attacked it, it would be equivalent to opening up an entrance to the heart of the Qingtai continent. The third prince and the 11th prince would then be able to stab him from the left and right, and the situation would be extremely dangerous. Because of this, he had no choice but to look for his trusted aide, who had given him advice earlier, and said, "Didn't you say that you would send an envoy to persuade his people to attack the two families? Why hasn't there been any movement until now?" The aide smiled bitterly and said, "I have sent several men, but there has been no news from them. They must have been intercepted on the way, and I have no other choice. Why don't you ask the true immortals to send them off?" In reality, it was not difficult to send the message to the outside world. Even if the road here was blocked, the message could be sent to the Heaven Court, and then sent to the Heaven Court. However, the key was to convince the deities. They must first promise them enough benefits, and that would be best if it was someone close to Hao Ji. Furthermore, the letter must be stamped with Hao Ji's prince's seal. If either of these two things were missing, it would be difficult to gain their trust. Hao Ji was extremely frustrated, so he waved his hand and dismissed the aide. He took out a talisman and looked at it. This was given to him by Dedao, and it could be used to escape in times of danger. However, even if he was really expelled from the fief this time, it did not mean that he would lose. He gritted his teeth and said to himself, "It should belong to me, no one can take it away from me." Inside the ZK mountain, the atmosphere was heavy. Ji Lu and the other two sat in the hall with solemn expressions. Just now, they had received news that Yin Kuang had appeared in the Qingtai continent, and they had no idea when he had gone there. Ji Lu frowned and said, "What is this person trying to do?" Yin Kuang had never revealed his true intentions to anyone other than Dongguang. He was the Heaven Court's immortal official, the Celestial Emperor's personal attendant, so it was impossible for anyone to pry into his secrets. After he betrayed the lower realm, he used the heavenly talisman to hide all his thoughts. The three Taishang swore that they would never touch this item again, so the people below him would not know what he was thinking. The three of them instinctively felt that something was wrong. It would be fine if this person was targeting someone else, but if he was also targeting the second prince, then things would not be good. With the heavenly talisman in his hands, they might not be able to get away with it. Once something happened to the second prince, they would have to make another choice, and all their plans would have to be restarted. This was not something that could be settled so easily. Ji Lu said in a deep voice, "We cannot allow In Kuang to do as he pleases in the lower realm. We must report this to the ancestral masters and confiscate the heavenly talisman from him. We will detain him and let the heaven court control him." Ji Lu and Ji Chang both agreed. Just as they were discussing, they suddenly heard a clear voice. The three of them were stunned and stood up. They saw a boy holding an imperial edict in the sky, and he said loudly, "Ji Chang, Ji Sheng, the Taishang orders the two of you to hurry to the Qing-Tai continent and protect the second prince's life." Ji Chang and Ji Sheng bowed and said, "Yes, ancestral masters." The boy's hand shook, and a golden ray of light fell. He said, "Ancestral masters have said that if you meet In Kuang, you can release this item to help the two of you defeat the enemy." Ji Chang quickly reached out to receive it, and he thanked the boy. When he stood up again, the boy had already left. Ji Lu said, "Since the ancestral masters have given the edict, I invite the two of you to head to the Qing-Tai continent and protect the second prince. As long as he is alive, there is still a way to save the situation." Ji Sheng's expression was solemn as he said, "We have to prepare for the worst. If In Kuang, Quan Dao, and that forgetting memory mountain were to conspire against me, then we might not be able to resist them even if we go all out." Ji Chang also said in a deep voice, "If the land is taken away, even if we can protect the second prince's life, it will be difficult for him to ascend to the throne in the future." Ji Lu shook his head and said, "We are not at the end of the line yet. Other than the Qing-Tai continent, the second prince still has another piece of land. We can go there when the time comes." Ji Chang reacted and said, "Heavenly Mother." Ji Lu nodded. Not only did the second prince have a piece of land from the heavenly monarch, but Heavenly Mother had also secretly given him a piece of land. Although this was unfair to the other princes, he was the son of the heavenly monarch and Heavenly Mother. He was born to suppress the other brothers, and no one could say anything about it. Therefore, even if he failed here, he would not lose the right to compete for the throne. At most, he would have to retreat and regroup. Therefore, protecting his life here was the most important thing, or else, everything would be empty talk. Ji Chang and Ji Sheng were slightly relieved when they heard this. The two of them bid farewell to Ji Lu and left the mountain gate. With a change of heart, they instantly arrived at the Qing-Tai continent. Hao Chu was overjoyed when he heard that the two of them had arrived. He personally came out to greet them. He bowed and said, "The two Daoist elders have finally come. Half an hour ago, Xianglan County was conquered by my third brother. He can reach the city at any time. Apricot Continent is in danger. I hope the two Taoists can save me." Ji Chang returned the bow and said, "Your Highness, please don't worry." He took out a talisman and said, "Your Highness can hang this talisman on the palace gate. It should be able to protect the palace." As if he had found a life-saving straw, Hao Chu hurriedly ordered his servants to carry it out and invited the two Taoists into the hall. In Kuang, who was outside, saw this scene and frowned. At this moment, he suddenly felt the talisman jump. When he turned around, he saw three Taoists with fluttering robes, walking on light. They were Wan Guang, Yi Guang, and Ding Guang. In Kuang's heart skipped a beat and he went forward to welcome them. "Why are the Taoists here?" Wan Guang smiled and said, "Ji Chang and Ji Sheng are the true immortals of Zik Mountain. Since they are here to protect the Qing-Tai continent, how can we not come? Later, I and my two fellow disciples will hold them back. If Suoyu Zhong wants to do something, just do it." Chapter 1919. Zhang Yan sat in the Li Wang mountain and observed the changes in the mortal world. At this moment, he saw that the three families, including the Li Wang mountain, had entered the battlefield and all the chess pieces were placed on the board. He knew that if he handled this situation well, he would be able to win in advance. With a single thought, he concealed all the signs of the heavenly secrets that were related to the heavenly secrets. At almost the same time, he felt that there was a whale in the sky that was cooperating with him. He knew that the two grand exalts of Quan Dao had made their move. With this, it was unlikely that De Dao would be able to find a way out with heaven's secrets. His gaze landed on the Taixing region. It all depended on whether the 11th prince and the 3rd prince could grasp this rare opportunity. With the 2nd prince gone, De Dao became an important chess piece. However, as an orthodox sect that was recognized by the heavenly court, although it might not collapse, the situation would undoubtedly be much more open. The changes in heaven's secrets were also noticed by the Purple Fault Mountain. Without a doubt, only the Li Wang Mountain and Quan Dao could do this. It might even be a conspiracy between the two families. The 3 grand exalts of De Dao also felt the danger. The disciple's life was undoubtedly the most important. In order to ensure that the disciple could overcome this crisis, the 3 of them sent several disciples with the surname, Ji, down the mountain to protect him. However, at the same time, Quan Dao was also prepared to send more people down to the lower realm. However, both sides stopped there and did not make any further moves. This was because both sides knew that other than increasing the number of disciples facing each other, it would not really change anything. In the past, Quan Dao was inferior to De Dao and could only be suppressed. Now, with the addition of the Li Wang Mountain, things were different. At most, both sides could restrain each other. The key was still to see the success or failure of the princes. At this moment, in the Taixing region, after the 11th prince took over the Qintai city, he was firmly rooted there. Although the 2nd imperial prince had recruited the true immortals' private soldiers, he still had the 11th imperial prince, Qingguang and Xiuguang, who were both true immortals. There was no way he could shake the 11th imperial prince. After a few failed attempts at counterattacking, and seeing that the 3rd imperial prince had taken over the fragrant orchid county, he was afraid that the 3rd imperial prince and 3rd imperial prince would be able to take advantage of the situation. Thus, he could only choose to withdraw his forces into the palace, hoping that they would be able to defend this last piece of land. When the 2nd prince saw that there were no more obstacles in front of him, he was not greedy and did not attack the other 3 counties. He only sent a few Qi practitioners and a few thousand men to guard the mountain passes that they had to pass through. Then, he led his troops and successfully advanced to the little Qingyang Palace in the Qingtai continent. At this moment, the 3rd prince, Hao Chang, seemed to have a tacit understanding with him. He led his troops to the east and west respectively, sandwiching the Qingyang Palace in the middle. Now, the two families had a tacit understanding that there would not be any conflict before the 2nd prince was dealt with. This brought a great deal of pressure to the 2nd imperial prince, Hao Jiang. Even though the true immortal De Dao had comforted him and said that even if he was in danger, he could bring him away, he was still terrified. Fortunately, he knew how to control himself and understood that he could only rely on the people around him at this time. Not only did he not reprimand or punish them, he even distributed a large sum of money to them as rewards. The situation in the city also became much more stable because of his actions. This caused De Dao, Zhichang, and the other true immortals to look up to him. At this moment, outside the palace, the 11th imperial prince, Hao Neng, was standing on a high platform in the air, looking into the city. However, he realized that no matter how he looked, he could only see one side of the city wall. It was as if the higher he looked, the Qingyang Palace would change accordingly. A subordinate said to him, "Your Highness, the Qingyang Palace is a strong city. It was first built by the Heavenly Mother, who sent the craftsmen of the Heavenly Court. It is very magical." Later, in order to worship the Heavenly Mother, the people of the Heavenly Mother expanded the city. I heard that 3,000 practitioners were recruited and a true immortal De Dao was hired to cast spells. Every brick and tile was blessed with mana. What your Highness is seeing now was built at that time. The original palace was the residence of the 2nd imperial prince. Hao Ning nodded. In order to have a clear understanding of the situation, he immediately ordered a few Qi practitioners to test it out, and the results shocked him greatly. Be it the lightning strikes, the mountain torrents, or even the earthly fire, the palace remained unmoved. Not only was the palace sturdy, but it was also compatible with the mana of the Tao of virtue. Especially when there was a true immortal Tao guarding it, the whole city would become even more sturdy. Especially when the second imperial prince had the seal given by the Heavenly Mother, which could suppress and weaken Tao techniques. It was an extremely difficult task to break through. On the other side, the third imperial prince, Hao Cheng, was also facing the same problem. He said, "Before we came, the Taoists said that there is a way to break through the city. Can I see it now?" A practitioner replied, "Your Highness, no matter how sturdy the city is, it will not be able to withstand our efforts. However, when we cast the spell, true immortal Tao will definitely come out to stop us. That might delay the battle, so I have to build an eye. Your Highness, why don't you inform the 11th Imperial Prince? If we work together, it will be much easier." Hao Cheng thought for a while and waved his hand. "There's no need for that. We can make the first move. With the 11th Imperial Prince's personality, he will definitely not sit and watch." At this moment, a confidant came forward and whispered, "Your Highness, what if the 11th Imperial Prince really doesn't move?" Hao Cheng said calmly, "That's even better. If I expel the second Imperial Prince, with my reputation, the throne will be mine. I have to thank the 11th Imperial Prince." There was a Taoist standing beside him. He was a true immortal of the Quan Dao sect. His Taoist name was Yin Ming. At this moment, he stood up and bowed. "Third Imperial Prince, please allow I to break through the city." Hao Cheng's expression turned solemn. He raised his hand and bowed. "Thank you, Taoist." Yin Ming replied, "It's fine." He raised his finger and drew something in the air. After a while, an imperial talisman appeared. He called for a disciple and said, "Send this talisman to Tianzhong." The disciple stepped on the clouds and held the imperial talisman in his hand. He opened it and waved it downwards. Immediately, a round of light shone down. But at this moment, a spiritual light suddenly rose from the top of the little Qingyang palace. A talisman jumped out and emitted a white mist that blocked the golden light. The two sides faced each other for a while. Suddenly, a sharp sword ray shot out from the west and slashed the spiritual light. The talisman shook and became unstable. The disciple above saw this and became spirited. He used his mana to push the golden light forward. The spiritual smoke talisman couldn't withstand the pressure from both sides and was gradually suppressed. Inside the palace, Ji Cheng frowned. It was not easy to deal with a pincer attack from both sides. He called out, "Junior apprentice brother, please help me." Ji Xing responded. The two of them used their mana at the same time. In a split second, the spiritual smoke rose up a few inches. But it was only a slight increase. After a few breaths, both sides increased their strength. It was obvious that there were more people attacking and they couldn't withstand it. Ji Cheng thought for a while and said, "Junior apprentice brother, let's stop." Ji Xing was surprised but he didn't insist. He withdrew his mana. Without the support of the two, the talisman immediately weakened. It was suppressed to the top of the city wall, maintaining the last bit of spiritual light. But this was also exhausting the foundation of the city. The longer it lasted, the more damage it would cause to the little Qingyang palace. Ji Xing was puzzled. "Just now, there are two more junior apprentice brothers here. Why don't senior apprentice brother ask them to help?" Ji Cheng said with a heavy expression, "Forgottenly Mountain and Quan Dao are working together. Even if we fight against them, we won't be able to win. If this drags on, it won't end well for us." Ji Xing said, "Qingtai continent is the territory of the second prince. The 11th prince and the third prince came from afar. If this drags on, won't it be beneficial for me?" Ji Cheng shook his head, "Not so. The second prince may seem to have some foundation, but he has already taken out everything he has. On the other hand, the 11th prince and the third prince still have some strength left. If this drags on, it will be disadvantageous for me." Ji Xing said, then what does senior apprentice brother think we should do? Ji Chang said in a low voice, this place looks indestructible but it is actually a dead end. Rather than being forced to retreat, it is better to escape as soon as possible. Ji Xing thought about it and nodded. After they reached an agreement, they immediately asked for the second prince. Ji Chang told him the reason why they had to leave and advised, time is of the essence. Your Highness, please don't hesitate. Please leave with us as soon as possible. That way, we can preserve our strength. After tidying up, we can come back and fight again. Hao Ji's expression changed. He thought that he could rely on the sturdy city to hold on. He didn't expect Ji Chang and Ji Chang to want him to leave. Even though he was reluctant to leave, he knew that he couldn't do anything if he left. He gritted his teeth and bowed solemnly, I'm counting on you too. Ji Chang was satisfied with Hao Ji's quick decision. He said, this time, there shouldn't be too many people leaving. Your Highness should only bring along your trusted aides. The recruited soldiers can be dismissed first. This way, the 11th prince and the second prince won't have any excuse to make things difficult for them. They can be recruited again in the future. Hao Ji immediately agreed. He bade farewell to the two and left to make arrangements. Because it was not an easy task to reconcile the interests of all parties, especially to appease the gods. After all, they would be of use in the future. Thus, it took him 7 days and nights to arrange everything properly. At this time, the small Qingyang palace was showing signs of breaking down. No matter how sturdy it was, under the attrition of many loose immortals and even genuine immortals, the restrictive power was being stripped away layer by layer. It would not be long before it was broken. Seeing this, Hao Ji was glad that he made the decision early. Otherwise, even if he could leave, he would have to abandon his trusted aides. In that case, even if he retreated to another fief, without the help of the Heavenly Mother, he would not be able to do much. He brought his subordinates to where Ji Chang and the others were. He said, Dear Taoists, I am ready. When do we leave? Ji Chang calculated and saw that it was still the same as before. Heaven's design was still chaotic. He gave up and said, Since your Highness is ready, we will leave now. With a single thought, he brought Hao Ji and the rest into a ray of light. Then, together with the rest of the virtuous cultivators, they exerted their mana at the same time. With a loud bang, they left the small Qingyang palace. With his ability, he could have brought everyone to another place in an instant. However, when he tried, he was blocked by an invisible force. He knew that this place was covered by a magical treasure. Ji Chang had expected this, so he was calm. Just as he was about to leave this place, 2 rays of light flashed in front of him. 2 Taoists stood in front of him. One of them smiled and said, Dear Taoists, you are in such a hurry. Where are you going? Chapter 1920. Ji Chang's expression froze. He recognized these two as Yin Ming and Xian Ming from Quan Dao. These two were of the same generation as him in terms of mana and cultivation. If he were to get entangled with them here, it would be difficult for him to escort the second prince away when the people from Liwang Mountain arrived. Thus, he called out in his heart and 2 Taoists of the Ji generation understood his intention. They stepped out from the crowd and confronted Yin Ming and Xian Ming from afar. Ji Chang said, Let's go. He waved his sleeves and rode the wind and clouds, carrying the group of people away. After traveling for a while, they saw a flash of sword light in front of them. Then, a Taoist with 2 swords on his back stepped out of the void and appeared in front of them. His aura was fierce, especially his eyes which were extremely sharp. Anyone who looked into his eyes would feel a sharp pain in their heart, as if a sharp sword was slashing towards them. Ji Chang did not know this person, but he could guess where he came from. He said, Liwang Mountain. The Taoist bowed and introduced himself, Liwang Mountain sword holder, Qin Guang. At this moment, another Ji generation cultivator stood out and said, Senior brother and second prince, leave quickly. I will block this person. Ji Chang said, Be careful, junior brother. The cultivator said, Don't worry, senior brother. Ji Chang nodded. Even if the people of the Ji generation could not defeat the opponent, they could still escape and their lives would not be in danger. Thus, he was not worried. He used his mana and once again rode the wind and clouds to escape. However, the road ahead was clearly not smooth, and before he had gone far, there were people charging out to obstruct him. It was impossible for him to stop and face the enemy, so he could only send out his subordinates one by one to obstruct the enemy. In this way, layer after layer of obstructions, there were fewer and fewer people protecting him. Ji Chang's expression gradually became serious. He had no way of avoiding this kind of thing. Logically speaking, as long as he did not leave the range of the magic treasure above, there was no place that was safe. The only thing he could do now was to barely calculate under the restrictions and try to escape to the place that was most beneficial to him. After a few more interceptions, there were only a few people left. Even Ji Xing stayed behind to block the enemy just now. At this moment, he suddenly felt his chi flow a little. His heart stirred. This was a sign that he was about to break free from the restriction of the magical equipment. As long as he put in a bit more effort to charge out, then the sky would be high and the sea would be wide, and he would be able to move unhindered as he pleased. Just at this moment, they suddenly saw a grand and clear light descend. From within came a young Taoist. He bowed to them and said, forgetting Li Shan's sword holder, Wang Guang. Ji Chang's heart sank. He looked around and realized that he was probably the only one who could stop this person now. Fortunately, there were a few juniors who had decent skills and were at least on par with Ji Quan. He could rest assured that they would continue to protect the second prince. He said sternly, Changling, Changhe, Changliang, the three of you will escort the second prince to his fief. If anything goes wrong, you don't have to come back to see me. The three Taoists behind him nodded and hurriedly left. Wang Guang looked on indifferently and didn't try to stop them. Ji Chang turned around and said solemnly, I will accompany you to the outer space. Wang Guang nodded. Then, the two of them turned into a blur, and in an instant, they had left the mortal world and escaped into the outer space. Changling, Changhe, and the others followed the path that Ji Chang had pointed out just now. Not long after, everyone, including Hao Chang, felt their bodies lighten, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. In front of them, the sky brightened, and the haze was gone. It was obvious that they had escaped from the magical equipment. One of the servants said in surprise, Your Highness, you have finally escaped. Hao Chang was also excited, but he didn't make a sound, because he could feel a pair of eyes staring at him. As for Changling and the other two, they were still nervous. They knew that they were not out of danger yet, so they didn't dare to hesitate and tried to turn their mana. However, when they did this, they felt a strong force enveloping them, making it impossible for them to move and escape immediately. The three of them turned to look and saw a middle-aged scholar with a Xieji crown on his head. His beard reached his chest, and he was walking in the air. Changling was shocked, left Imperial Censor in Kuang. They didn't expect that this person would make things difficult for them after they managed to deal with Quan Dao and Forgotten Li Mountain. This person had a heavenly talisman, and if he used it properly, not only would he not be weaker than Ji Sheng and the others, he might even be stronger. Changhe walked out and said with a serious expression, Left Imperial Censors Zhua, please make way. In Kuang looked at the three of them and said, Leave second Imperial Censor here, and I will let you go. Hao Chang panicked. He was more afraid of In Kuang than his brothers, so he said, Elders, Changhe said, Don't worry, Your Highness. Since we are under orders to protect you, we will not abandon you. He looked up and said in a low voice, Left Imperial Censors Zhua, are you not afraid that Zeke Mountain will punish you for your actions? In Kuang said expressionlessly, There is no need to use Zeke Mountain to pressure me. Since I am here, I do not care about such things. If you are not willing to leave, then I will have to do it myself. At this moment, in the Haonan camp of the 11th Imperial Prince, someone reported, Your Highness, the 3rd Imperial Prince has sent someone to ask if Your Highness wants to enter the city with him, or do you want to discuss it elsewhere? Before Hao Chang left, he had already dismissed all the conscripted soldiers. Once he left, the entire small Qingyang palace was like a palace city, and the next step was to determine the ownership of the city. At this moment, an elder stood up and suggested, "Your Highness, the small Qingyang palace is the capital of the Qingtai continent, and the essence of the continent is contained within it. This is the foundation of the king's business. If your Highness can occupy it, your reputation will multiply, and the world will yearn for it." Hao Cheng thought for a while and said, "Just let third brother enter the city, I will not go." The elder panicked and advised, "Your Highness, you cannot back down here, and this is not the time to talk about brotherhood." Hao Cheng shook his head and said, "It is not that I want to back down, but the small Qingyang palace is different from other places. It is not a place that can be easily taken over. If I try to snatch it, it will only bring me a lot of trouble. It was a place where the Heavenly Mother Goddess gathered, and it was a hot potato. If it was not handled well, it would attract many variables. Moreover, it was not the time to go against his third brother." The elder continued to advise, "Your Highness, I understand your Highness's concerns, but as a king, one must have the courage to conquer the world. How can you be afraid of a mere obstacle?" How could Hao Cheng not understand this logic? However, he had a deeper consideration, and there were some things that he could not explain to his subordinates. These people did not know the reason and would naturally come to the opposite conclusion. He could only say, "There is no need to say anything more, I have made up my mind. However, if third brother wants me to give up, he should also give me some benefits." Seeing this, the elder could only sigh and retreat. About an hour later, the third prince, Hao Cheng, received the news. "Just now, the 11th prince's messenger has arrived. He said that he has used up a lot of money, and if your Highness is willing to compensate, the 11th prince is willing to give up and let your Highness monopolize the small Qingyang palace." Hao Cheng said, "Oh. Did he really say that?" One of the confidants was overjoyed. He stood up and bowed, saying, "Congratulations, Your Highness. It is only right for your Highness to be the Lord of the Heavenly Court." Hao Cheng looked at him and said, "Why do you say so?" The confidant said, "The 11th prince is greedy for small gains and forsakes the greater good. At this moment, he does not care about the hearts of the people in the world. Instead, he is fixated on small gains. He does not have the mindset of a ruler, so how can he compete with your Highness?" Hao Cheng was delighted, but he did not show it on his face. He said, "Since my 11th brother wants these, then give them to him." The confidant said, "That's right, Your Highness. Not only must you give them, you must give them more, and let the world see." Hao Cheng acted quickly. After the order was given, an envoy immediately sent over all the items that the 11th prince needed. Moreover, he even doubled the amount. After Hao Ji received these, he did not keep any of them and rewarded them all. This caused everyone in the army to rejoice. The elder smiled bitterly and shook his head, sighing, "The third prince's intentions are unfathomable. This way, everyone in the world will know about this. Unless your Highness forsakes morality, it will be hard for you to compete with him for this place." Hao Ji saw that this matter was settled. After everything was settled, he prepared to leave. The subordinate asked, "Your Highness, are you going back to the country of law?" Hao Ji said, "Qintai city was conquered by me. Since the small Qingyang palace has been given to the third brother, how can I give this place away?" The elder who made the suggestion sighed. The 11th prince had missed a great opportunity by abandoning the little Qingyang palace. However, he had placed so much importance on a place that did not affect the overall situation. He was really neglecting the essentials. The third prince, Hao Cheng, saw that the 11th prince left without hesitation. He felt a sense of relief. When he heard that the 11th prince had retreated to Qintai city, he did not move anymore, as if he did not want to give up all his gains. After hearing this, he was not angry. Instead, he thought to himself, "It seems like the 11th prince's armament strategy is only a so-so. I originally thought of him as an opponent, but now it seems like he is just a so-so." However, he did not plan to fight with the 11th prince immediately. This was because the second prince was not dead yet, and their common enemy was not gone. It was not a good time to fight. Moreover, even if there was a result, he could try to get Quan Dao to discuss with the Forgottenly Mountain again. If they could come to an agreement, then there would be no need to fight anymore. On that day, Hao Chang entered the little Qingyang palace under the escort of the crowd. After he took control of the place, he called for one of his trusted subordinates but did not say a word. The confidant understood tacitly and said, "Your Highness, this subordinate already knows what to do." Hao Chang did not say anything. He stood up and turned to leave. After the confidant sent him off respectfully, he stood up and looked for the head of the maids. He said, "When we attacked the city, the Celestials in the palace had gathered troops to help us. Now that your Highness is here, who knows if they will have other thoughts? Bring your men and kill them all." The head servant said, "Minister, before the second prince left, he had already dismissed his private soldiers. Moreover, most of them have expressed their willingness to follow the third prince's orders." The confidant interrupted him and said with hatred, "It is hard to tell whether they are sincere or just waiting for an opportunity. Moreover, they are not willing to pay the tribute. It is obvious that they are still loyal to the second prince. We can't stay here and cause trouble. Do you understand?" The head servant felt cold sweat on his back. He knew that once he did this, he would not be able to escape the punishment of the Heavenly Mother. However, there was no way he could refuse now. He gritted his teeth and said, "Yes, Your Highness." Chapter 1921. After the head servant took over the task, he did not think too much and immediately went back to gather his men. He was initially afraid that the gods would notice them because they were considered part of the Turtle Mother's tribe. Whenever they were in danger, the heavenly court would give them a warning beforehand so that they could hide. But this time, he realized that the second prince was completely unaware of his actions. He guessed that the second prince had already planned this. In fact, this was not because of the second prince. Instead, it was because Zhang Yan and Quan Dao, the two grand exalts, were working together to conceal the heavenly secrets, causing the heavenly realm and mortal realm to be unclear. Now, even the three grand exalts of virtue and Tao could not accurately predict anything, let alone the heavenly emperor and heavenly mother. After the head servant arranged everything, he did not dare to delay for too long and immediately took action that very night. The gods would never have thought that the third prince would actually attack them. Even though they had private guards, they were scattered all over the place and it was difficult for them to stick together. Therefore, they could not defend against the second prince's demon soldiers. In addition, the head servant had the help of some unknown cultivators, so they could not fight back at all. Within a night, all the gods inside and outside the palace were killed without a single survivor. Although Hao Chang had taken over the small Qingyang palace, he stayed the night in a large tent outside the city. He did not sleep but sat silently behind the table. Only his eyes flashed. He was waiting for news from inside the city. At around 7 a.m., a voice came from outside the tent. "Your Highness." Hao Chang said in a deep voice, "Come in." The curtain was lifted and the confidant walked in. He lowered his voice and said, "Your Highness, it's done." Hao Chang did not reply immediately. His breathing became heavier but he quickly regained his composure. He said calmly, "Kill all the demon soldiers that entered the city last night. Leave no one alive." The confidant bowed and said, "Yes." Hao Chang paused for a moment and added, "Treat the head servant Chilua's people well." The trusted aide nodded, clasped his hands, and retreated. There was a flash of light in the tent and a Taoist walked out. He stood there and said, "Your Highness, Turtle Mother will definitely punish you for what you have done." Hao Chang sneered, "Even if I didn't do it, she wouldn't have allowed me to ascend to the throne. Why should she interfere with the Hao clan's matters?" These gods were the true foundation of the Hao clan. Over the years, they had relied on the power of the Heavenly Mother to fight against the Hao clan. How could they let go of such a good opportunity to weaken them? He believed that even if the Celestial Emperor knew what he was doing, he would definitely acquiesce. Furthermore, even if Heavenly Mother Kuang were to investigate, she could probably push the blame onto those demon soldiers who did not listen to her orders. It could be said that there was no evidence. Moreover, in order to support him, Quan Dao would definitely help him block the pressure from the Heavenly Mother, so he was not afraid. He leaned to the side and said, "How is my second brother?" The Taoist said, "My fellow apprentice brothers are in the midst of intercepting them. Your Highness, please wait patiently." Hao Chang said, "I have waited for so many years, I can wait for a few more days." At this moment, amidst the clouds, Yin Kuang saw that Zhang He and the others were unwilling to retreat. With a thought, a talisman that radiated golden light flew up by itself and hung high up in the sky. Rays of light shone down from above and instantly dyed the blue firmament. Changling, Changhe, and Changling were about to use their mana, but when they were shown by the light, they immediately felt their bodies float, as if there was a huge force trying to push them out of this world. They knew that this was the power of the heavenly talisman. If they let their guard down even a little, they would immediately be sent somewhere else. They hurriedly gathered all the mana in their bodies to resist, but the power was abnormally strong and continuous. Although they were not sent away, they were unable to move. Yin Kuang restrained the 3 cultivators of Tao of Virtue and was about to attack the second prince when he suddenly frowned and looked to the side. He saw a faint purple aura and a Daoran appeared there. It was Daoist Jilu from Zik Mountain. Just now, he suddenly felt uneasy, suspecting that something had happened here. However, it was difficult to discern the mysteries of heaven. In order to ensure his safety, he didn't wait for the Grand Elder to issue an order and instantly teleported over. When he saw the current situation, he also rejoiced in his heart. If he came a step later, the consequences would be unthinkable. He looked at Yin Kuang and said in a low voice, "Zui Yuzhong has gone too far." Yin Kuang did not respond and only stood there indifferently. Jilu shook his head and said to the second prince, "Your Highness, I will deal with this person. You protect yourself." Hao Kuang quickly retreated to the side and then took out a seal and placed it on top of the sky. This item was given to him by the Heavenly Turtle Mother and could suppress the supernatural powers of cultivators. He had relied on this item to attack the Qi practitioners. However, he did not know how effective it would be against the Heavenly Talisman. It was not that he did not want to take the opportunity to escape, but there was no one around to protect him. If he went out alone and encountered a perfected immortal, he would definitely be captured by the other party. Just now, when Jilu spoke, he secretly tried and found that he could not remove the restraints on Changhe and the others. This also meant that he could not escort the second prince away. Therefore, the only way was to directly deal with Yin Kuang, the master of the heavenly talisman. At this moment, his expression was solemn because he was not completely confident that he could deal with the heavenly talisman. The original purpose of this item was to restrain all the Qi practitioners in the world and had a natural restraining effect on him. At this moment, he could only hope that the other party had not mastered the use of this item yet. At this moment, Yin Kuang looked at the sky and said slowly, "Priest Jilu, it is impossible for you to reach the sky." When he came out, he knew that Perfected Immortal and Forgottenly Mountain were restraining the Tao. Before the result was out, they would not stop. Therefore, he had plenty of time to deal with the other party. Jilu saw that he was standing still, but suddenly, he felt a monstrous pressure pressing down on him. His body suddenly became extremely heavy. As a person of Dao, he knew a little about the heavenly talisman. He knew that this item could restrain any supernatural powers or Tao techniques. However, when the master of the heavenly talisman fought against it, if his spiritual thinking was slightly slow or if he did not grasp the opportunity, he would lose his rigidity. If he could constantly change his tactics, he would be able to avoid to a certain extent, and then there would be a chance to defeat his opponent. At this moment, the heavenly talisman turned and a ray of fairy book shone down. In an instant, Jilu successively changed a dozen divine abilities, but he quickly noticed that all these were of no use. The fairy book had actually directly invaded the Dharmakaya, and it seemed that all his countermeasures were useless. He couldn't help but be greatly shocked. Obviously, his opponent had already utilized this item to an extremely profound level. At this moment, Ying Kuang said calmly, "Priest Ji Quan, please go back." As he said this, 5 fairy books on the heavenly talisman disappeared forever. Ji Lu said, "You." He only had time to say one word before he disappeared from heaven and earth. Chang He and the other 2 were also sent away, and no one knew where they were transferred to. Ying Kuang turned his head and looked at second Prince Hao Ji. Without saying a word, the heavenly talisman on top of his head turned, and a mighty force struck down on him. Second Prince Hao Ji staggered, and a ball of light burst out from his body. This was because he had the Celestial Emperor's Edict of Exemption, and with the protection of the talisman on top of his head, he did not die. However, this could only block 1 or 2 attacks. He panicked and shouted, "Zui Yuzhong, why do you want to harm me? If you let me go, I will definitely ask my mother to pardon you." Ying Kuang looked at him indifferently, and the heavenly talisman continued to turn. After a while, the talisman in the sky first exploded, and then the light on Hao Ji's body dimmed. When the last bit of light dissipated, he was penetrated by a ray of rainbow light. Hao Ji stood there blankly for a moment, disbelief and fear still lingering in his eyes. After a while, his body exploded with a bang, and his chi was like a flourishing firework that spread in the sky. Then, it all turned into ashes and scattered all over the mortal world. Ying Kuang looked at this scene and did not speak for a long time. A clear light flashed, and Dandy Light appeared not far away. Ying Kuang said slowly, "Priest Dandy Light, I killed a prince, so the Celestial Court will definitely send a Celestial Lord to arrest me. If I fail, I will ask Mount Li Wang to take care of my disciple." Dandy Light said, "I will bring them to Mount Li Wang to cultivate. Zui Yuzhong does not need to worry about this." Ying Kuang nodded and said no more. After 10 breaths, he suddenly raised his head, looked at the sky, and said, "They're here." A rumbling sound came from the depths of the sky, and the sun suddenly became dim. Then, the stars in the sky lit up one by one, and thousands of stars shot down. Dandy Light knew at a glance that it was the Celestial Lords descending to the lower realm. The Celestial Court's military affairs were all in the hands of these Celestial Lords, and they were the most powerful force in the Celestial Court. With a decree from the Celestial Arch, apart from the Grand Elders, any chi practitioners or sects in the universe could be easily annihilated. The demon soldiers on the ground could not be compared to them. Ying Kuang said in a deep voice, "Priest, we bid farewell here." When he finished, he straightened his body and went to meet the Celestial Lord. In Mount Li Wang, Zhang Yan saw that the second prince was dead, so he retracted his arcane energy and returned. At this moment, he suddenly felt something, and with a thought, he once again went to the palace in the nameless place. When he walked in, the 2 Grand Elders were also there. After greeting each other, the 3 of them sat on the seats that they used to sit on. The Daoist on the left said, "With the second prince's death, Daoda has lost a key person. However, Zeke Mountain will not stop just like that. They will definitely find another candidate, and I will foil their plan." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoists, who do you think virtuous Tao will choose?" The Taoist on the right said, "2 people, the Crown Prince and the 14th Prince." In fact, the Crown Prince was the most suitable candidate just now, but he hated the heretics and disliked the Hao clan and Si clan, so it was impossible for him to ascend to the throne. However, because of his special identity, no one paid attention to him, and almost all the princes pretended that he did not exist during the competition. The 14th prince was undoubtedly the last choice that the Celestial Arch left for himself. If the prince that was chosen through the competition did not meet the Celestial Thearch's expectations, then this prince would most likely be the final winner. Zhang Yan thought about it. The 14th prince was raised by the Celestial Arch, so no one could do anything to him. Here, the Celestial Thearch's wishes were the most important. Since Quan Dao and Mount Li Wang had won this time, they had the right to compete with Quan Dao by working together. Therefore, they could exert pressure on him and find a way to force him to give in. Chapter 1922. After Zhang Yan and the 2 Grand Elders reached an agreement, the 3 of them wrote a letter and sent it to the Heavenly Court. The Heavenly Emperor had to make a decision on the spot. Their actions made it seem like they weren't being very courteous to a celestial emperor, but in reality, this was how the Grand Elders usually treated him. Even the few Grand Elders of Virtue and Tao used coercive methods to deal with the Heavenly Emperor. There were cases where they respected the Heavenly Emperor's wishes, but it was rare. At the end of the day, as the Grand Elders of Tao, if it was not for that item, why would they care about a true God? Even if this true God was favored by the heavens and earth, it was still ordinary. However, the three of them also knew that because Tao of Virtue and Tao used to be the orthodox faction, the Heavenly Emperor would not dare to agree hastily. They could only wait until they gained more advantages before they could make the Heavenly Emperor give in. Therefore, if there was no obvious result after this battle, the two sides would most likely have to fight to determine the winner. After Zhiluo was teleported away by the Heavenly Talisman, he was trapped in an unknown place. However, he knew that the second prince could not be saved, so he did not teleport back. Instead, he returned to Zeek Mountain as soon as he was free. All the perfected immortals of Tao of Virtue and Tao sensed the second prince's death. They were originally fighting with the Forgottenly Mountain and Tao of Virtue and Tao sect, but since the second prince was gone, there was no need for them to continue fighting, so they quietly retreated. At this moment, Ji Chang and Ji Xing returned one after another. Although they did not suffer any injuries, the atmosphere was extremely heavy. Ji Lu said in a low voice, "The second prince is dead. If Zeek Mountain wants to maintain its position as the orthodox faction, we must choose another prince." Ji Chang said, "The seventh prince can be used." The seventh disciple was their other choice. Since the second prince was not around, the seventh disciple was the most suitable candidate. However, Ji Xing did not agree. He shook his head and said, "The seventh prince has already been pushed out of the battle in the lower realm. Even if we are willing to choose him, the Heavenly Emperor may not agree. It is difficult for us to stand on our side." Ji Chang thought for a while. Other than the seventh prince, the other princes were not suitable. He frowned and said, "Then do we have to choose another great prince? However, he is especially hostile towards me. What can I do?" At this moment, Zhilu said, "There is one more candidate." He raised his head and looked at the two of them, the 14th prince. Ji Chang and Ji Xing looked at each other. Ji Chang said with a serious expression, "Senior brother, the 14th prince is the Heavenly Emperor's final choice. He won't let this prince join any family easily." Ji Lu said in a deep voice, "Then let's report to the founding master and try to get him to decide on this matter." Beyond the heavens and earth, countless severed limbs and broken weapons and treasures floated about. Together with the broken palaces and flying ships, they almost covered the entire void. Ying Kuang floated here by himself, and at this moment, his eyes were closed tightly as if he'd lost consciousness. In the next moment, he opened his eyes and a bright light flashed. Then, an invisible force spread out and pushed away the remnants floating near him. Then, he slowly straightened his body. Since arriving in the void, he had fought a bloody battle with the All-Heaven Star Lords who came to capture him. However, after this battle, apart from being slightly exhausted, he was actually unharmed. The power of the Heavenly Talisman far exceeded his imagination. The All-Heaven Star Lords' bodies were all shattered. However, this person was transformed from star essence. Normally, he only resided in a giant body that was as large as a mountain. As long as the starlight was not extinguished, he would not die. After he was banished to the lower realm, his immortal record was taken away. At this moment, he could at most be counted as half a cultivator. Therefore, as long as the Heavenly Court was willing to pay any price, they could send an endless number of Star Lords over. Then, they could definitely exhaust him to death. He had just rested for a while and had already recovered some strength. Looking out, the starlight in the distant sky had once again lit up. It was likely that the next wave of attacks was about to arrive. Thus, he braced himself and quietly waited here. However, what surprised him was that just as the bright starlight was about to burst out, it suddenly paused, and then gradually dimmed. He frowned. If there was no accident, the Heavenly Court should have given up on this expedition. He couldn't help but think that the heavenly court retreated at this moment. On the surface, it seemed that they were afraid that he would control too many heavenly talismans, causing the karma between heaven and earth to become chaotic and restless. However, deep in his heart, he believed that this was not the only reason. The Star Lords were not completely flawless. As long as the heavenly star essence that resided in the void was erased, the Star Lords would cease to exist. Just now, he once had the thought of directly charging into the void and killing this person. In reality, if this person came again, he was prepared to take action. Perhaps it was because of this thought that the heavenly court was aware of it and did not dare to cause trouble for him in the short term. However, he had stayed by the heavenly emperor's side for a long time and understood the heavenly emperor's thoughts very well. Logically speaking, he was already weak at this time and should have killed this person in one go. As the heavenly emperor's control over the heavenly talisman became better, it might not be so easy next time. However, the heavenly emperor did not do so because he had some concerns. The biggest possibility was that he might need the heavenly Star Lords in the near future and did not want this person to suffer too great a loss. He thought for a long time. Since the heavenly court had given up, he could leave this body behind and do more things. Thus, he turned and left, returning to the human world. On the other side, the 11th prince, Hao Neng, handed over the apricot continent that he had conquered to a trusted aide and returned to Yenlu Kingdom. His biggest gain from this trip was to gather more than half of the Qi practitioners in the apricot continent under his command. The third prince occupied the Qingyang Palace and amassed a large amount of wealth. He even heard that because all the true gods in the palace were killed, everything of this generation fell into the hands of the third prince. With the wealth that he plundered, he could easily gather 1,000,000 demon soldiers. However, he believed that these Qi practitioners would be the most important support for him in the future. Especially after this battle, he realized that under the situation where the Quan Dao and De Dao were in a stalemate and could not pour too much power into the lower realm, this generation could play a more important role in stabilizing the situation. After settling the matters that had accumulated in his kingdom, he personally went to the place where Yi Guang cultivated and said, "Daoist Yi Guang, I intend to visit the Grand Elder at the Forgotten Li Mountain, is that okay?" On the way back, a Qi practitioner had suggested that he try his best to make a trip to Li Wang Mountain. Because after this battle, everyone would know that he was on the same side as Li Wang Mountain. However, he hadn't officially declared his stand yet, and such a matter couldn't be delayed for long. After he heard that, he felt that it was a good idea, which was why he suggested it. Yi Guang smiled and said, "That is easy. Prince, please wait for a moment, I will ask the ancestral master." He immediately stood up and ordered his subordinates to set up the incense table, burn the incense, and pray. After a while, he felt a thought enter his mind. He bowed 3 times, turned around and said, "Prince, the ancestral master allows you to see him." Hao Neng was relieved, and he bowed deeply to him and said, "Thank you, Taoist. When can I visit the Grand Elder?" Yi Guang smiled and said, "If it is convenient for you, Prince, you can go now." Hao Neng nodded solemnly and said, "I will go back to make some preparations, and then I will follow you up the mountain." Yi Guang looked at him deeply and nodded when he heard him address him as a junior. Hao Neng took this trip very seriously. After he returned, he immediately burned incense and bathed. He also ordered his subordinates to prepare many offerings. Although the Grand Elder did not need these things, he still had to make the necessary gesture. The next day, he went to Yi Guang again, and the latter rolled up his sleeves and flew up. Hao Neng felt that he had landed on a celestial mountain, and there was a Taoist palace in front of him. Some Taoists were cultivating in the open space in front of the palace, and no one looked at them. Yi Guang said, "Prince, please wait here for a moment, I will go into the palace to report to the ancestral master." Hao Neng quickly said, "Thank you, Taoist." Not long after, a Taoist child walked out and said with a clear voice, "Are you the 11th prince? The ancestral master is summoning you into the palace." Hao Neng cupped his hands together and followed the Taoist child inside. When they arrived at the main hall, they saw that there were 2 Taoists standing on both sides of the hall. Yi Guang stood on the first seat on the right. Further up, there was a high platform where a young Taoist dressed in a black robe sat. However, even though his silhouette was extremely clear, when it was reflected in Hao Ning's mind, he could not see his face clearly. As the son of the celestial emperor, he knew that the Grand Elder was beyond the heaven and earth, and was not someone he could see. He quickly lowered his head and bowed respectfully, saying, "The 11th Prince of the Heavenly Monarch, Hao Ning, greets the Grand Elder." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "11th Prince, please rise." Hao Ning said loudly, "With the help of the Forgotten Mountain, the power of the Fenghua Kingdom is growing, but my brothers are only greedy for personal benefits, and none of them care about the people. I have the heart to rule the world, but I do not know how to do it. Please tell me, Grand Elder." He was not afraid that the Celestial Emperor would know, and he did not need to hide his true thoughts. When the Celestial Emperor was the first to banish him to the lower realm, he knew that if he did not fight for it, when the other brothers ascended to the throne, not only would his own fate be difficult to control, even the people who followed him would not have a good ending. Therefore, he took this step forward, and there was no turning back. Zhang Yan looked down and said, "After the prince ascends to the throne, are you willing to worship the Forgotten Mountain?" Hao Ning heard this and bowed deeply, saying solemnly, "If I can ascend to the throne, I will worship the Forgotten Mountain as the righteous sect. My son will worship the true deity of the Forgotten Mountain as his teacher, and I swear that I will never go back on my words." Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "If I want you to expel the Tao of virtue, and the Tao of perfection, are you willing?" Hao Ning was startled and immediately realized what the Forgottenly Mountain wanted to do. He was shocked, but after thinking about it for a moment, he felt that he was now tied to the Forgottenly Mountain, and he couldn't stop the Forgottenly Mountain from doing anything, so he didn't think too much and said, "I'm willing." Zhang Yan said with a smile, "Since you call yourself a disciple, then I will treat you as a disciple of the Forgotten Mountain." At this moment, a spiritual light shot down and fell into Hao Ning's arms. He looked down and saw a small, shiny seal. He knew that it must be a rare treasure, so he carefully kept it. Zhang Yan said again, "You are now a prince, and it is not suitable for you to stay in the mountain for long. Go down the mountain first, and there will be people who will help you in the future."